This is the moment we've been waiting for. I don't think I've ever wanted, nay needed, to see an old man get punched as much as I do right now. The need is, it's strong. This chapter revealed Saint Saturn to be an extraordinarily sadistic mastermind with desires and tendencies somehow worse than even that of the average world noble. So that dude definitely needs a punching. First up though, we had 3 beautiful, much needed pages of closure with Bonnie. And seeing Bonnie apologize to Vegapunk was so tragically heartwarming, especially since she reverted to her actual form to do it. It makes it more genuine, more honest, and more emotionally vulnerable. And it also made me remember that Vegapunk is huge. In the panel of Bonnie as a little girl, the size difference makes sense, but then if you look at a shot of adult Bonnie and Vegapunk, he is a truly massive guy. But this explains Bonnie's light switch mood shift. Seeing Bonnie act so casual after the Egghead time skip led to all of these wacky theories about how it's actually Katarina Devon in disguise and such. But it turns out that flip happened quite early on. Bonnie saw the memory, she had a heartfelt cry, and this is very sad, but then recovered pretty immediately. Because as sad as learning all of this was, what Bonnie got out of this was the irrefutable proof that her father loved her all along and was thinking about her right up until the very last moment of his life. In many ways, what Bonnie just saw was a celebration of Kuma's life, as well as the inspiration to keep going and make a life for herself with this gift that Kuma gave her. Now, speaking of, Kuma also got Bonnie a tangible gift, which is a sun-shaped sapphire. And we need to talk about sapphires because they come back later on in this chapter in a far more twisted and frankly sickening capacity. But this gift is very classic Kuma. When Bonnie was a child, actually I suppose she still is, when Bonnie was a younger child, Kuma always encouraged her to be proud of her jewels. And that's the sole negative effect of getting rid of the sapphire scales. Bonnie loses the jewels that she was so proud of. And so Kuma made sure to supplement that with a replacement sapphire, which is sweet and everything, but my god, the very concept of this stone is a mixed blessing at best for Bonnie. Because we also have the revelation that it was Saint Saturn who gave Ginny the disease in the first place, which was passed on to Bonnie. Now, quite a few people did pretty much word for word call this, because as soon as the disease had a name, quite a few people were very quick to point out that the blue sapphire is the associated gemstone of the planet Saturn. And I'm not going to pretend to understand historically who, why, or how this connection was made between stone and planet, but it has to do with a particular brand of astrology. And regardless of my personal ignorance as a man on the internet, it's very clear that Oda is definitely aware and has used this as inspiration, especially since the necklace Kuma gave Bonnie is very in keeping with the astrologic, if that's how you say it, beliefs of what gemstones one should wear and when. But I do want to flag this. Sapphire scales and amber lead syndrome are very similar. Amber lead being the disease that Law and the rest of Flavance were infected with, which is also translated as white lead in English. And similarly, the white sapphire as well as diamonds and opals are associated with Venus. And in terms of the elder star, Saint Ethan Baron V. Nasjuro happens to be the warrior god of finance, aka the one who was more than likely in charge of overseeing Flavance's rise to affluence via the mining of white lead ore. And I'm not saying that Ethan created this disease, as it appears Saturn may have, but it's entirely possible that he allowed or even encouraged the entire kingdom to mine it, knowing its effects purely for the financial gain of the world government. And then when they found out, he had them exterminated. So after looking this up, Venus is also a planet that represents metal, and that's the thing that ore is, and I believe Saturn is Earth, which makes sense, sapphire scales turning the infected skin into hardened stone. So again, look, I'm not a huge fan of astrology, but it would appear that Oda might be, or at the very least he's very knowledgeable about the sector, because all of these connections are a bit too hard to ignore. And as for another connection that's incredibly difficult to ignore, this is the part of the video where we quite seriously need to ask, is Saint Saturn Jewelry Bonnie's biological father? It's a bit tricky because there are currently 3 translations floating around on the internet, all of which are kind of crap in their own fun and unique ways, and all of them are quite cryptic about Ginny's status as the 8th wife. For some context, we know that world nobles quite commonly have multiple wives that they cycle in and out at any given time, but what's particularly vague here is whether Saturn was referring to Ginny as his 8th wife. And at the moment, I'm inclined to say yes just because of what happens next. Looking at it from the perspective of the world nobles, and Saturn says as much in this chapter, they obviously don't view people as people, they're more like property. And within whatever sick world noble etiquette there is, would one world noble allow another one to experiment on their property? property? I would say not, because they just don't seem like the sharing type of people. But also, the conspiracy goes so much deeper. Remember that Kuma and Saturn had a bit of a chit-chat on God Valley before Kuma saved all of those people, no, it saved all of those properties, and whisked away to Sorbet. And Saint Saturn has never forgotten that moment, and he has never let it go. Saturn isn't just going to let the last surviving Buccaneer wander off and live in peace. Nah, because in Saturn's own words, Kuma was the descendant of a clan that once committed a grave crime against the world, the last survivor of the extinct Buccaneer people. So Saint Saturn doesn't just want Kuma dead, he wants Kuma to suffer for the crimes of his people. And the type of evil that Saint Saturn is the kind of guy to keep track of Kuma, and when he learns that one of Kuma's very close, how shall we say, intimate associates is Revolutionary Army member Ginny, then that leads Mr. Saturn to take a special interest in her. He abducts Ginny, he does unspeakable things to her, some of which he spoke about in this chapter, and he makes sure to release her with enough strength and life remaining to take that message back to Kuma. Because that's what it is, it's a message. Ginny's skin is riddled with sapphires, which we now know is kind of like Saint Saturn's signature, but that's only half the plan, because Ginny had a daughter which Saturn knew that Kuma would feel compelled to raise, and he would probably be happy with either outcome from here. Kuma would either have to watch his daughter die, which is lol, classic World Noble prank right there, or Kuma would have to seek a cure, and Saturn knows that there is no cure because he created the thing, which would eventually lead Kuma straight into the wide open arms of the world government. Saturn didn't have to do anything, Kuma came to him, and in that moment of weakness that Saturn himself had created, Saturn struck a deal to have the last remaining Buccaneer completely hollowed out and placed in the service of the world government. I'm not saying that every step along the way was part of Saint Saturn's master plan, but he has expertly taken advantage of the situation at every step. And he may very well have had this long-term project designed just to torture Kuma as much as he could before killing him. And the reason why Saturn could be Bonnie's father becomes even more sickening, because if that is the case, then both of Bonnie's fathers would have given her sapphires, one as a gift, a protective charm, and the other as a curse, a thing designed to kill her to torture that guy. But as it turns out, that's not the only gift that Saturn gave to Bonnie. And I'm honestly thrilled to have a satisfying answer to this, because I was a bit taken aback when we didn't see Bonnie find and eat her devil fruit. I thought that was really weird, but it all makes sense now. I mean, I say all, there is still one thing I question, but it's very minor. Essentially though, Saturn has been Vegapunking and was able to imbue Bonnie with a magical fruit power as a baby without having her actually consume the fruit. So she's had this power almost from birth, which I think makes her the youngest devil fruit user in the series. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any others who ate a devil fruit as a baby, with the sole exception of Baby 5, but that's because of the name, not the age. This was definitely brought up in the chapter where Bonnie's powers manifested, but I remember questioning this possibility, because we do see an image of Kuma and Bonnie bathing, which from my perspective, Bonnie is half submerged in water, and devil fruit users are affected by being submerged in all water, not just seawater. So there's a little bit of a thing there. Doesn't matter, we're gonna let it go, because we also have some important clarification on Bonnie's actual abilities. Although this is another one that I think we do need to wait for the official translation to fully clear up. But as far as I understand it, Bonnie's powers allow her to transform or transform others into any future form that she perceives as possible. Which means that the only reason why this fruit is pretty shockingly overpowered is because it's being used by a child. And the more one comes to understand the reality of the world, the more limited the fruit's abilities become. Not even understand so much, but the more you come to accept reality. Which is why Bonnie's powers actively weaken in this chapter, because her belief in Nika wavers. Bonnie resigns herself to death, so she doesn't believe that anyone's coming to save her, not her father and not Nika. Which turns what was a previously devastating punch into more of a slap with a wet noodle. So it's a pretty cruel devil fruit actually, and I can definitely see why Saturn chose this ability to experiment with, because he and the world government seem to specialize in breaking people's spirits. So it's almost like giving someone a taste of ultimate freedom, only to break that spirit down and have the fruit respond accordingly by getting less and less powerful. And you know, if playing through 3 Danganronpa games has taught me anything, it's that maximum despair can only be achieved by offering a little shred of hope. And up until the end of this chapter, I think that Saturn has been extremely effective in administering despair. But something I'm very curious about in regards to Saturn is that he does the thing again. Right before the Kuma flashback started, Saturn was threatening to kill Bonnie, but ordered the Marines to do so by shooting her in the head. And other than, well, for funsies, I don't really see the reason why he needs to do this. Why can't Saturn just make Bonnie's head pop like that one Marine who was too curious for his own good? So is Saturn just insisting on a particularly morbid way to kill Bonnie? Or is it the idea that he, World Nobleman, doesn't doesn't want to dirty himself with the squashing of insects? Or is there some special condition to do with his powers that prevents Saturn from exploding Bonnie for whatever reason that is? And if so, could that reason give us an opening? At first, I thought that Devil Fruit users might be immune from Saturn because the two people who do move in this chapter are Luffy and Bonnie. They both seem unaffected by the paralysis that everyone else is under, but then I realized that Vegapunk is also paralyzed and he's a fruit user, so yeah, there goes that idea. We do have to mention Luffy though, because there's a pretty big development that happened here incredibly sneakily. The first thing I want to say is that I really appreciate Luffy's role in this chapter, because overall it's a really heavy experience with a lot of dramatic revelations building tension, and by the end of the chapter that we'll get to, the promise of a release of said tension. But amongst all of that, we get Luffy acting like a goofball, begging for meat and then out of nowhere stuffing himself with food. And I think it was just the right amount of comedy to give readers the opportunity to take a breath and then return back to the seriousness. But we definitely do need to ask, who gave Luffy all that food? From the look of the burgers, fries, and cola, it looks like the food was made in the replicators that we saw very early on in the arc, and the people who we know who would know how to use those would be Luffy, Bonnie, Chopper, Jinbei, the Vegapunks, Kizaru. Actually, there's a lot of people who know how to use them. And you know what? Even if you didn't know how to use them, they're probably easy enough to just press and play. But most of those people can be ruled out because they're either not there, or if they are there, they're paralyzed. So here's my initial thinking. Maybe, just maybe, good old beloved Swamp Nakama has come through for us once again. Just like he did on Wano, he hoarded an entire banquet within his swampy innards, and knowing that this island is surrounded by marines, Caribou knows that there's only one way out, which is to feed Luffy. Because if it worked against Kaido, then surely it can work against an Elder Star. And also because Caribou is sneaky, very sneaky, and with his swampedness, he has known to evade detection before. So while everyone's looking up there, focusing on Saturn and Bonnie, Caribou from behind, he slithers in, dumps a pile of food, and slithers back out. And at the moment, one of the only other reasonable options I can think of is that Luffy's Nika powers have become so insane that he can literally imagine food into existence, which I think would be the final step in making Luffy far, far too overpowered, because he then becomes self-sustaining. Now, the other option is Kizaru. In this chapter, I do think he's implicated as a culprit through the power of juxtaposition. We see Luffy eating, stuffing himself, and then we cut to a panel of Kizaru sitting there with a thought bubble thinking of nothing. Sort of like I don't know who could have done this, it certainly wasn't me. And fair enough, because the dude can move at effectively light speed, and Kizaru does show some sympathy for Bonnie and Sentomaru in this chapter, and that could even be the beginning of Kizaru flipping on Egghead Island and heading towards some redemption. I mean, after the Kuma flashback, I'm no longer sold that Kizaru is going to stick to his duty. I think there definitely is the potential for him to flip, but as fast as his powers are, they aren't particularly subtle. It's a pretty big deal every time Kizaru makes a move, and also he wouldn't necessarily know or understand the impact that food has on Luffy. The way I interpret this panel is more like Kizaru saw who gave Luffy food and decided not to say or do anything about it. But again, this was a bit of fun and a good chance to breathe, because I definitely needed it, as immediately after, Bonnie had a full-on breakdown over the next couple of pages. Bonnie very much comes to terms with what she's up against, deems it impossible to overcome, and thinks that it would have been better if she'd just died. Because everything that happened to Kuma, well, not everything, but a lot of the things that happened to Kuma were all for her. And the fact that she's going to die here makes all of that sacrifice pointless from her perspective. It gave me a wave of nostalgia back to the Enies Lobby era, because Bonnie saying that it would have been better for her to die reminds me a lot of Robin's resignation to death, because she viewed it as both inevitable and the best outcome for the Straw Hats to be saved. Or like Nami's moment where she feels so powerless that all she can do is stab her tattoo. And knowing that Bonnie is only 12 makes all of this that much more potent. To push a 12-year-old into believing that it would have been better if she was dead is a whole different sphere of evil. And it also takes me back more recently to chapter 1095, which was actually titled Better Off Dead in This World, where Kuma's father said that his mother was better off dead. A memory which Bonnie saw and may have even informed her own thoughts here. But then the moment that we've been waiting for does finally arrive, and it was so incredibly satisfying to see Kuma finally reunite with Bonnie. In fact, those last 2 pages might be my favorite 2 pages of the year. And a lot of you probably noticed this, but the way Oda drew Kuma saving Bonnie is very much with the same positioning as the iconic moment where Ace sacrificed himself to save Luffy. 2 great martyrs being struck and, dare I say, penetrated from behind. But the beautiful part of this is that we then get something that we didn't with Ace. Because imagine if after that Ace just turned around and clobbered Sakazuki. That's what appears to be happening here with Kuma. Although honestly, I'm kind of annoyed that Oda would deny us the satisfaction of seeing the punch in this chapter. It's like, Oda, mate, We end with Saturn's face about to be punched, and it's such a blue balls moment. Oda builds everything up to this and says, "Welp, see you guys next year." But the really cool thing is that we also confirm that Kuma is a haki user. He doesn't have either of his gloves on, so this darkened hand is definitely armament haki, which is a much bigger deal than usual, because haki is of course a manifestation of willpower. So I guess the biggest revelation in this chapter is that Bartholomew Kuma is not dead. And I mean, like, I don't get too excited, because I don't know exactly how much of him still exists. It's probably not much, but there's something there. At the very least, it's enough to have willpower. And that second last panel of Kuma is my favorite of the chapter. I love how Oda creates the sense of overwhelming power about to strike through the intentionally sketchy line work. And when it comes to the character, I love that he drew Kuma with his teeth grit, which seems like a minor thing, but that is such a human thing to do. And it reminds me of the panel from chapter 1099 when Kuma had to stop Bakori by performing the legendary one-man revolution. We saw him there with his teeth grit in sheer fury. The angriest we'd ever seen Kuma up until this chapter where he does it again. And there's also an even more raw sense of anger due to the type of attack that Kuma's going for. Because with Bakori, Kuma attacked him with an open palm, but with Saturn, it's a fist. Kuma is not using his powers and he's not fighting intelligently. What he's doing is seemingly for the first time in his life, taking out his raw anger on someone. Although in a way, this does make his story that much more tragic. The idea that some of Kuma is still clearly in there, and the thought that he's endured life beyond the cyborg process, and that part of him may have been aware of how the world nobles were using him on Marijois. But whatever the case, this is one hell of a way to cap off 2023, and it seems like 2024 is going to begin with a punch that may rival or even surpass the likes of Bellamy or St. Charles. Have Kuma's memories returned since the deal was broken, or when the bubble was popped? So what we're trying to do here is figure out the mystery of what triggered Kuma to suddenly snap on Momoira Island and get to Egghead as quickly as possible. Because up until whatever it was, he was being a very, very good boy. He was just sitting there chilling, letting Lindbergh try to repair him. But look, to figure this out, we kind of need to figure out the timeline of Egghead Island, which is very tricky to put together because we've been traveling all over the Grand Line. You know, we go to Hachinosu, we go to Winter Island, we go to Elbaf, we go to Momoira Island, we go to Marijois, and none of this is necessarily happening at the exact same time as the corresponding Egghead events as presented to us. To make things even more confusing, on 2 occasions we even go into full-on flashbacks, which takes us back in time. And actually, Egghead Island is one of the very few arcs in One Piece to have 2 fully fleshed out flashbacks, Kuma and the Reverie. And then we even have a time skip on Egghead Island, skipping the night where everyone foiled York and the Seraphim, so Egghead Island is just, it's a bit of a nightmare for keeping track of time. But look, let's try to figure this out. So potential trigger point number 1. This is what happens if we take things at face value as presented by Oda. So the actual time that we saw Kuma get up and pop away was in chapter 1067. And as presented to us, Kuma suddenly leaves Momoira Island just as Rob Lucci and CP0 arrive on Egghead Island, which is also pretty much the exact same moment that Bonnie comes into contact with Stella. To be specific, it was right after Bonnie fainted after threatening Vegapunk with the lightsaber that summons all the bugs. So maybe there was some combination of Bonnie both being in trouble and on Egghead that triggered Kuma there. It feels a bit underwhelming, but imagine if that actually was the answer. It's not anything grand or dramatic. Kuma was just made aware that his daughter was afraid of something. That something, being small bugs. Doesn't matter what it was, his fatherly instinct spurred him into action. And to be fair, what Kuma found when he arrived on Egghead Island was a giant arachnid, so the bug problem is pretty real. And I know that spiders aren't bugs, but I'm one of those people who just does not care. I live in Australia, so I don't have the luxury of semantics when facing off against all of the giant creatures constantly trying to kill me. But the second potential trigger point is Bonnie touching Kuma's memories, because we know that the pain bubbles get absorbed permanently by whoever takes them on first come, first serve. But we don't know for sure if the memory bubbles function in the same way. It could be that Bonnie touching the memory bubble then returns the memories to Kuma. And then Kuma, with his brain back, wasted no time in leaving. The logic being that he would know exactly where Bonnie is because he knows exactly where the memories are. And here's the touching part. He might not even have thought she was in danger. It's just that after experiencing his entire life, Kuma may have felt the need to be there to comfort Bonnie because, as we've all just experienced, Kuma's life contains some pretty heavy stuff. off. Then of course trigger point number 3 might be receiving the sapphire necklace, just in case it has any special inbuilt science program to react to Bonnie, and it might be part of Vegapunk's personality switch mechanism that he may or may not have done. I'm not as keen on this one because every time we've overanalyzed something small like this during the Egghead arc, the answer has usually been it was just a sweet gift or a sweet gesture. Then again, Vegapunk did say it was a protective charm, so it could be something. But then trigger point number 4, and this is what the commenter was alluding to, but it may be Saturn breaking their deal by threatening and actively trying to kill Bonnie. It could even have been Vegapunk himself who flipped the emergency personality switch upon seeing the developing situation with Saint Saturn. Although this one it might be slightly difficult to believe because it would mean that Kuma was able to get all the way from Momoiro Island to Egghead Island in a matter of minutes, which very much goes against the travel time that we've seen the Straw Hat Steak, the whole 3-day venture. The whole 3-day thing doesn't really matter because as presented to us, Kuma definitely gets from Momoiro Island to Egghead Island in a day, less than a day. And we also see in chapter 1098 that Kuma went from East Blue to South Blue seemingly instantly when the Revolutionary Army HQ called for help. So maybe Kuma can travel far, far more quickly than we realize. I really love that Kuma, by the way. It's one of my favorite pieces of channel art, and I often get asked in the comments where the art in my videos comes from. And the answer to that is that I have 3 artists who work to produce content for the channel. One of which, Tenguki Arts, has started a Redbubble store, which is linked in the description and contains a lot of channel artwork that you can get as fun stickers and posters. To be clear, none of the profits of this store go to me. This is all towards Tenguki. But if you're interested in having some of these amazing drawings for yourself, and I think you should be, then definitely check out his store, again linked in the description. Do you think Kuma's body using Haki is similar to Sindri's body from Thriller Bark, still having willpower? So they're similar but different. With Kuma, we're kind of asking the question of how much of a soul or personality remains in the body after the memories are taken away. Like what Dragon alludes to in the chapter talking about instinct, how much raw instinct remains. But Sindri was quite different, in that her body was given someone else's personality, because Dr. Hogback was such a corpse-obsessed mofo that he took Sindri's body and used Moria's abilities to give her the shadow of a girl named Margarita, a maid who lives in a place best described as somewhere and had a hatred of plates for some reason, which is why Sindri hates plates, because that's Margarita's personality coming through. Interestingly though, it was that powerful, dare I say, instinctual hatred of plates that led zombie Sindri to become capable of disobeying Hogback's orders to some degree, which is also the sort of thing we're seeing right now on Egghead Island with the Seraphim, because deep down they do retain their original personalities, or at least the seeds of that personality. And going back on Thriller Bark is quite fascinating, because when Moria takes Luffy's shadow, he makes a vow with it to erase Shadow Luffy's memories, which Hogback laments and says that he should have done so with Sindri, although what he means to say is Margarita. So it's very interesting that memories get brought up in Thriller Bark, which is a very important arc for Kuma as it turns out. So maybe it's not an accident that Oda used it to explore the theme of willpower, memories, and individuality there as well. Kuma could be alive, that's very true, but I like the idea that it is his fruit. Usually Zoans are the ones mainly with wills, but the quote, hands of revolution could be an exception. Well look, I'd even go a step further, because in the fictional pirate reading world we live in, we can't really take anything at face value anymore. Kuma might not even be a Paramecia fruit user. He could be yet another secret Zoan and or mythical Zoan, which could be hinted at by the pause, as well as Ginny's mental depiction of the fruit abilities, alongside the dragon Zoan in chapter 1096, which is the rather adorable kitty cat image. And that would be quite the situation, like a very convoluted way of making one of Vegapunk's classic living objects. Except this time what we did is we had a real person eat the fruit, and then in the most literal sense of the word, we objectified said person, removing any remaining sense of living being, replaced a lot of organs with all sorts of fun metals and stuff, and then over time the fruit's vessel has become an object. And because Zoan fruits have wills of their own, the poor fruit then inherits Kuma's body. I think that one's a pretty big stretch. Then again, anything's possible. One thing to note that a lot of people seem to have missed. When Kuma lands, he immediately says 30. I believe he probably has already activated self-destruct mode and has less than 30 seconds left. So this is a comment that I've been seeing a lot, and whilst the idea is kind of cool, the actual answer is that it's just a translation problem. When Kuma lands, some of the numerous scans this week decided not to translate the sound effect in this bubble, which to our Western swine eyes very much looks like the number 30, but it's actually the katakana yo and the katakana ro, which I will admit do look like a stylish 3 and 0 when put together, but in Japanese, yoda yoda is the onomatopoeia for shaking, wobbling, and general unsteadiness. So the idea here is that Kuma has landed on Egghead, but he's so injured/broken that he's struggling to get up. Yoda yoda yoda. And in general, I also want to reiterate that I have nothing against reading scans, but if you do, please read multiple sources and definitely read the official translation as well. Because this week especially, there were a lot of awful translations that were produced for the prestigious race to be first on the internet. Question/clarification request. Did Oda make a mistake drawing both of Kuma's feet? Alright, the feet thing. So I was thinking the same thing. In this chapter, we see Kuma on multiple occasions with 2 feet. And look, we're not shaming him for that. I myself have 2 feet. It's a very normal way to be, unless one of said feet has been previously melted away by magma. Then it's very unnormal. Which in chapter 1092, it was heavily implied. I mean, I say heavily, but I feel like it was pretty definitely shown that this foot was caught in magma and had been burned away. And it's not the only Kuma damage inconsistency either, because Sakazuki Sakazuki'd him by blowing away a chunk of Kuma's head. Not at all a Whitebeard-sized chunk, which is massive, but still, this is very aesthetically impactful damage. But in 1103, Kuma's head seems to be fully intact, because the epic punch panel at the end is shown from the perspective of the side of the head that was theoretically blown off. I mean, at the very least, his bear hat should have been damaged. I mean, what is that thing made of that it can defend against magma? But look, I don't know if Oda forgot because he very specifically focused in on those moments, but maybe and actually no, I won't throw you in with this, you watching person, because you might be very clever and may not have read this way, but definitely me, maybe I misread the situation. Going back on the foot incident in particular, I guess we don't see it come off, so it could have made contact with the magma, but Kuma's just so powerful that he gets to keep his foot. Good on him. And I guess the key thing about this panel is seeing Kuma visibly showing signs of pain, which is quite a human thing to do. Earlier on, Sakazuki even says, at least you still bleed like a man. So it might have been intended to hint that Kuma has that little bit of humanity within him still. It's funny though, because I have a little channel animation of Kuma fighting Sakazuki and leaving his foot behind, which a lot of people got really annoyed at the last time I used because they thought it was an editing error. And now, it's fair play to them because it actually is an error. The whole thing has come full circle and I'm not happy about it. I've been thinking, but since Bonnie literally experienced about 30 years worth of memories, wouldn't that effectively make her more mentally mature than a majority of the Straw Hats? Look, in theory, yes. Bonnie did just experience 45 whole years of life, because that's what Kuma's age was pre-time skip, but in practice, it's probably never going to be brought up like that. It actually reminds me a lot of an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation called The Inner Light, where Picard experiences something extremely similar. He's given the memories of an alien, and Picard then proceeds to live through until the end of said alien's life. It's actually very similar. I'm pretty sure that Picard experiences about 40 or so years, and he was like 60 years old at the time. So if you do the maths, about 40% of his total life experience so far was this completely different person. It's a sort of thing that would drastically change someone's personality. But then the next week, Picard was back to normal, and they never really did anything interesting with it. So if you want to go really deep, Bonnie has lived longer as her father than she has as herself. And at this point, she should probably be more Kuma than she is Bonnie. But that sort of idea is very complicated and messy, and honestly, I'm happy to skip over all of that, so long as we get to see the geriatric spider get punched in the face. So you're saying sapphire scales are kind of like being bukake'd by Saint Saturn? I mean, I really didn't need that image, but yes. Although I should clarify something. Saint Saturn didn't infect Ginny with the sapphire scales on purpose, or more accurately, he didn't experiment on her with the end goal of Ginny developing the disease. Saturn was working on creating another unknown drug for unknown purposes, and Ginny developing sapphire scales was a side effect, a sign that the intention of Saturn's experiment had failed. And I'd be both fascinated and terrified to find out exactly what Saint Saturn was trying to do here, whether it was a drug intended for use amongst the world nobles, or whether he was simply trying to create a brand new torture device to continue to use on all of the insects he collects. It really could go either way. And with that, I'd like to take this opportunity to point out that Saint Saturn might be the first truly evil villain we've had in One Piece. Most other villains have done categorically evil things, but that's not necessarily who they are at their core. Many of them are misguided, shaped by circumstance or necessity, and you know what, even the average world noble, I don't know if I'd necessarily call them evil, because I don't think they're aware that their actions are evil. They're like like children with far too much power and a surgically removed moral compass. Saturn, on the other hand, he knows exactly what he's doing and he relishes in it. That is the key difference. It's quite demonic and genuinely unsettling in a way that I've never felt before in One Piece. Thoughts on what Dragon is planning? Nothing. Right now, I'm pretty sure he's just thinking about what bottle of wine to have with dinner. To be fair, that's an important decision. If you pair the wrong wine with the wrong meal, then you're going to lose a lot of the subtle flavors, so there's a lot to think about. You keep saying that Bonnie's powers would get weaker as she gets older, because the world is horrible. But it's also the same weakness in Luffy's fruit. I agree. Not only that, I agree that it's the same strength in both. Bonnie and Luffy's fruits operate on a very similar level. At their core, they function best when the user disregards reality and believes that nigh on anything is possible. And what should be of particular concern to the world government is that these fruits have a compound effect on one another. On her own in this world, Bonnie can't do a whole lot. That imagination can only carry her so far, given that her whole life has been so full of pain and isolation. However, once she does finally make the connection that Luffy is Nika, which just as Saturn says in the chapter, I can't quite believe that she still hasn't done yet, but once she does, Bonnie is going to believe that anything is possible. If she registers that Nika of all things exists, then Bonnie becomes completely free and her powers are unrestricted. If Nika exists, everything can exist. Why not? And then the world government is just going to have to sit there and say,
"This is getting out of hand. Now there are two of them."
Bet Kizaru is the one who fed Luffy light-speed food delivery. So I'm still not 100% convinced that it was him, but I would very much like to share this picture I found on Twitter. And look, if Kizaru does end up being the culprit, then this meme, much like a man's dreams, will never die, and he will forever be known as the Uber Eats Admiral. Delicious justice. But the other thing about Kizaru being the feeder is that sure, he can move at light speed, but surely the Egghead Island food machines can't produce food at light speed. And if so, then essentially what this theory is stating is that Kizaru blinks away, finds himself a food machine, then presses some buttons, and has to wait for all of the food to appear and then blink back. The blinking back and forth, that's no problem, happens instantaneously. It's the waiting. He'd just be standing there while the machine goes brrrr, you all know how machines sound. And then he'd have to do that like, 30 to 50 more times to produce the sheer pile of food we saw. Although I love the idea that if you look closely, there's even a drink in the pile. So Kizaru would have had to have been considerate enough to think that Luffy might want something to water it all down. Although someone in my comments also suggested that it could be Usopp sniping the food to Luffy, which is really cool. Others were very confused and thought Robin was the one delivering the food because of all the hands, but those were just Luffy's hands moving really fast. It's a really intriguing mystery though. Of all of the Egghead Island intrigue we've had to date, the traitors and the shadow monsters, that one we still haven't solved. But right now, don't care, because the thing I am most invested in is who fed our captain. It's always nice to see Yamato in the color spread. I'm assuming the dragon is Momonosuke. Oh yeah, so I didn't talk about the color spread, but I actually really like it. So because this chapter officially comes out in 2024, this is Oda's celebration of the upcoming Year of the Dragon. And that's why all of the Straw Hats have either Momonosuke on their clothes or a color variant of Momonosuke. Zoro in particular has a green one, which gives me some very strong Shenron vibes. I get Momonosuke though. Year of the Dragon, he's an obvious choice. But I can't help but feel like Oda is just trolling with Yamato at this point, showing us an image of the crew that could have been. Although I also want to highlight Frankie because damn, this might be my favorite Frankie hairstyle to date. It's a shame that he didn't have it on Wano, but I guess it would have been such a pain in the ass to draw regularly. Not that Frankie was in a lot of Wano, so it wouldn't have come up that often. Although in World, it may have seemed a bit disrespectful to wear one's hair in the style of the giant dragon currently occupying and enslaving the country. This punch will either miss or do absolutely nothing to help. That's what I'm afraid of. Because as blue-balled as I am to be denied the satisfaction of watching that punch land, there may be a reason for that. Saturn himself is still a very unknown quantity, and he has already shown that he's fairly immune to classic damage, or at least the sword damage we saw. Right now, he also seems fairly immune to devil fruit abilities as well. Bonnie tried to use her powers on him, and nothing was happening. And not in a Thriller Bark sort of way either. Genuinely, nothing was happening this time. So she either tried to reverse his age, but Saturn is just so old that it has no visible effect, or our colossal spider lad may have a Blackbeard-style negation effect in play. Or third option, saying Saturn is immortal, and that frozen state of being is the direct counter to Bonnie's abilities. Saturn has no potential futures. He's locked in. He's locked in to this. Of all of the things to choose, you chose this form. But assuming the former, maybe that's the reason why Kuma is using a Haki punch, because he knows that his classic devil fruit powers may not work. But even if the punch does minimal damage, I need it to land because mate Kuma, he deserves this. There has never been anyone in One Piece more more deserving of a punch. Not Bellamy, not St. Charles, it is St. Saturn, so we need this. And you know what? You let me know in the comments. Is this punch going to land? And if so, just how satisfying is it going to be? One Piece is back. An old man got punched, a cyborg man got kicked, and another cyborg man got a lovely hug from his non-cyborg daughter. Aww. Meanwhile, two-time defending world champion Nico Robin is about to face her third Buster Call and go for a new world record. Exciting stuff. But before any of that though, there is a thing we need to talk about, and that thing is rats, or our rats, because the cover page is just adorable. I love the idea of Sanji serving at a teeny tiny restaurant with the rats getting engaged, and it probably feels like a bit of a random idea, but this cover page holds a lot more meaning than you may initially think. Going all the way back to his childhood, Sanji got his start in the culinary arts by cooking for rats, which led to the iconic Vinsmoke judge panel, where he orders Sanji to never cook again. And now every time there's a bad opinion on One Piece Twitter, someone without fail always posts that panel. Then during Onigashima, Sanji saved Osame's pet rat Chuji, whilst he was delivering the finishing attack on Queen, no less. And rats are very symbolic, by the way, because they're often considered the absolute lowest life form of society. Very similar to how humans are treated by the world government, especially in this case because Saturn was experimenting on them, but also quite similarly to how pirates are treated by other humans. So Sanji has a habit of cooking for rats, both literal and metaphorical. And the whole cover is also very evocative of Whole Cake Island with the wedding cake, and the female rat is even wearing quite a similar dress to Charlotte Pudding and making one of her trademark poses as well. I don't often enjoy cover pages to this extent, but this is a great piece of artwork that encapsulates all the core aspects of Sanji and references the long journey that he's been on to get to where he is today. Now, as for actual events, thankfully we pick up exactly where we left off, which feels like a month ago at this point. I guess it was technically last year. And Kuma lands what I think might be the best punch in all of the One Piece, even better than Charlos. And I don't know, I guess we'll have to wait until it's animated to fully judge its impact, but it's been a long time, a very long time, since I've been so satisfied by a single attack. I'm not sure about you guys, but this lands much harder for me than even Luffy's final attack against Kaido, and it's all about the build-up. Because the chapter starts with an abridged Kuma flashback, and something I really liked were the images Oda chose to use of both Ginny and Bonnie. Firstly, because I love that in these memories, Kuma remembers Ginny as he met her, rather than what she became after Saturn's experiments, which is exactly what Ginny wanted. And that flashback child Ginny transitions perfectly into a very similar pose from a modern day child Bonnie. So what we have happening here is generational retribution. There's a thread of pain that traveled from Saturn into Ginny to Bonnie to Kuma's fist, and finally returned right into the wrinkled face of Saint Saturn. So it's a beautiful thread to follow. And I love the panel of Kuma right before the impact. It's quite similar to the one at the end of chapter 1103, but I don't know if I've ever seen a One Piece character attack with this much implied power. And really, it's all about the teeth. The perspective shot of the panel really makes the teeth look so much bigger than they actually are. I mean, the surface area of those teeth in this one panel could house hundreds, perhaps thousands of Revolutionary Army refugees. That's how much space they take up. But it's the grit teeth that really gives you the feeling of power behind the punch rather than the punch itself. And even though it is a bit repetitious, I do appreciate seeing it again. Although it does make me wonder if this might have been the original plan to end 1103 with, but then Oda, I don't know, ran out of pages. Because it does feel like we needed to replay the events here for the first 2 pages just to get us back to the same point we were already at. And I have to admit, as much as my personal agenda is to inflict as much violence upon Saint Saturn as humanly possible, I do love this resilient look in the panel right before we see the full impact. It's this look of furious superiority. Like Saturn is definitely acknowledging what's happening here and cannot believe that this scum of the earth would dare lay a mega fist on his wrinkled yet heavenly and divine face. But this is everything I've wanted, and it comes with so much more weight than even, say, Luffy punching St. Charlos, because Kuma is a former slave attacking the world's highest authority. So you've got the very lowest standing up to the very highest. And I do hope that Kuma's actions get reported back to the Revolutionary Army, because that's the kind of inspiring story that could drive a lot of people to stand up for themselves and take action, especially if Saturn ends up going down for good in this arc. But even though this arc has been a deep dive into the mysteries of Kuma, this chapter opens up a brand new one. Saturn mentions that he's already activated the self-destruct mechanism, which good on him. He's a horrible old spider ghoul, but I have to give him consistent credit for making what seems to be all of the smart moves at the very least. I actually love his strategy here, and I think there's a really great argument to be made for allowing the Revolutionary Army to take Kuma. Let them bring bring the big bear bomb back to their headquarters, give them a couple of days, think, everything went well, and then casually erase the core of their operation with a single strike. So it would have been great if there actually was a bear bomb. As suspected, Vegapunk decided to go with a less literal interpretation of self-destruct and instead installed what appears to be a mind and body shutdown function. And with this, I think we finally have our answer as to why Kuma flipped out of nowhere. The Revolutionary Army rescued Kuma. Saint Saturn said, "No worries, mate. I, Saint Saturn, have this under control." Then he sat down and he waited just long enough for Kuma to be taken back to headquarters and then went, "Now," and pressed the button. At which point, instead of shutting down, Kuma did, well, not that, because he was finally free from taking any orders. It released that restriction on him, and whatever the special Buccaneer trait is, allowed Kuma's body the sliver of free will to go and do all of the things it is he did. Which is fantastic, because Saturn is now ultimately responsible for what could be his own demise. By insisting on a self-destruct mechanism, he did what world nobles do best, and he went that one step too sadistic. If he didn't go that one extra step, then everything probably would have worked out for him. But he pushed it that little bit too far, so much so that Vegapunk felt morally compelled to act. If Saturn hadn't demanded this function, then everything probably would have gone his way on Egghead Island. But the new mystery is the true power of the Buccaneer race, and Vegapunk, well, he has an idea of exactly what this is. It's not an idea that he's chosen to share with the rest of us, unfortunately. Well, at least not beyond the word love. But up until now, the special trait of the Buccaneer race has been assumed to be their chonksome, tanky nature. But it may actually be something much deeper and less apparent to the very logical eyes of scientists like Vegapunk and Saturn. And it might have been something that was much more obvious when there was an entire race of them. The world government probably didn't just want them eliminated because of their physical power or whatever crime they committed. But at the same time, it's very on point for the world government to disregard the value of any life beyond what physical labor it can provide. So whatever this special trait of the Buccaneer race is, and however much it ends up costing the world government on Egghead Island, it is entirely on the hubris of the world government for not being inquisitive enough to discover it, and therefore not being able to plan for it. So that, along with the self-destruct thing, means that Saturn has double doomed himself here. But other than the punch, the definite highlight of the chapter for me was Bonnie's reunion with Kuma. Because as much as I feel bad for Kuma's situation, at least he was able to make peace with it. He was perfectly happy to never see Bonnie again, so long as it meant that she got to go on and live a long, full life. Now, Bonnie, on the other hand, really needed this physical closure, which is made all the more touching because Kuma picking Bonnie up is very deliberately positioned like the very first time he met her in the Sorbet Kingdom Cathedral. Except in that case, Kuma was holding Ginny rather than Bonnie. And that's important because this is a full circle moment. Kuma failed to protect Ginny, and he didn't know this at the time, but he failed to protect her very specifically from Saint Saturn. So that was a very emotional hug of sadness, despair, regret, and all of the other pain words, but also resolution. Resolution to make sure that that didn't happen to Bonnie. And Kuma keeps his promise here, bending down to embrace his daughter, having saved her from Saint Saturn, and bringing the whole Ginny Bonnie saga to a nice bookend. And even though we don't know how much, if any, of Kuma actually remains in this body, Bonnie still got the opportunity to thank her father and tell him how much she appreciates him. And say stuff like, "No matter if the whole world calls you a tyrant, I will still know how cool you were, Dad." But the sweetest thing was when Bonnie recognized Ginny and said that her mother was an amazing woman. And again, Ginny gets her last wish because Bonnie only has Kuma's memories and thus will only remember her mother the way he did. But part of me is also wondering if this moment might be giving Bonnie a bit of false hope for the future. Because yes, in theory, she perfectly understands what's happened to Kuma, but him appearing here could give Bonnie the idea that this story might have a happy ending. As if all they need to do now is escape Egghead Island and then they get to travel the world together. But then Kuma stops moving. And I wonder if what we're heading towards is a going merry moment, where Kuma becomes physically unsalvageable and we give him a hero's funeral after he assists us in escaping from some sort of buster call. It really is very similar to the going merry situation, isn't it? Now, this chapter was also fantastic for those craving some good old Sanji Frankie action, and I am one of those. Egghead Island has been very Luffy Zoro heavy so far, and it's always nice to see the other Straw Hats kick into gear. And Sanji did what Sanji does by coming to the rescue of a young lady, very chivalrous, and generally great to see a Straw Hat attacking an Elder Star. Although Frankie, mate, he was the real deal here. You see, I was under the impression that Sanji was the chef. But in this chapter, Frankie makes us a beautiful donut when he sends a radical beam straight through Saturn's body. Of course, Saturn can regenerate though, in a very evil, twisty sort of way as well. And it's always amazing to see how authors handle regeneration abilities, because as soon as that becomes apparent, you can see the narrative inhibitors lifted. I swear, in any shonen manga, as soon as a character can regenerate, they become as fragile fragile as sugar glass, taking fatal wound after fatal wound, losing limb after limb, whilst every other character remains as tough as obsidian and is impossible to permanently damage. I'm really hoping that this doesn't start a trend of antagonist regeneration though, because that's something that can get quite tiring once it's an established requirement. But at the same time, I'm remembering all of the antagonists we have left. There's the rest of the Elders and Emu that probably share whatever demonic trait Saint Saturn has. Then you've got Sakazuki and Ryukugyu, who are both Logia users, and even Blackbeard's a Logia user, although it might not function in the same way as standard Logias. So most of the major villains left are definitely on the more regeneration side of things. And the same goes for Kizaru, who then quite rudely interrupted Frankie's fight battle, and we'll talk more about his wandering morality in a bit. But this part reminded me of something I love so much about Oda's art style, which is how he portrays light. Because One Piece is a very bright manga with minimal shading, it's actually impossible for Oda to draw something any brighter than his neutral style. So to create light, what Oda has to do is employ darkness with super stark shading, which gives the remaining neutral elements the illusion of being way brighter when they haven't actually changed at all. So it's a fun visual oxymoron. To create light, what you actually need to do is create darkness. But back to characters, this chapter leaves Kizaru in a very precarious position because it would seem that Egghead is continuing to touch what few feelings it is that he seems to possess. I love his line at the end of the chapter about how he should have worn darker sunglasses. It's like the One Piece equivalent of "It's a terrible day for rain." Except with the facial expression Kizaru's giving, you can't quite tell if he's being sarcastic or not. As per usual with this admiral, you could read his vague emotions in any direction. Like I said in the discussion video about Kizaru potentially redeeming himself, it looks like he is at the very least determined to kill Vegapunk because that was the exact wording of his mission. He was supposed to protect Punk Records, the power plant, and York, and he was supposed to eliminate Dr. Vegapunk. Now, as it stands, everything he was ordered to protect has now been kind of revoked by Saint Saturn's Buster Call, so Kizaru only has one standing order left, and it looks like he's at least about to try and carry it out. But outside of Vegapunk, Kizaru's got some feels going on, and this might be a stretch, but I do think he's doing what he can to protect everyone else within the bounds of his mission. Frankie, for example. In this chapter, Kizaru does kick him, which is a traditionally hostile activity, but it comes after some very thought-provoking words. Frankie says that they owe a lot to Kuma, which, by the way, he's the perfect person to deliver this line because he was the only one to encounter Kuma post-time skip when he got back to the Thousand Sunny. So Frankie understands this debt on a completely different level to the rest of the crew. And Kizaru does agree with this and actually uses that to challenge the Straw Hats, to see how much good Kuma's actions ultimately did. And that in and of itself is quite telling, because Kizaru is the kind of man who usually doesn't speak unless absolutely necessary and is generally a bit too lost in his own mind to even pay attention to what other people around him are saying. So Kizaru does recognize on some level that the Straw Hats are part of Kuma's legacy. So I do think it's possible that Kizaru might have kicked Frankie not to injure him, but to protect him from Saint Saturn, because Frankie got in a pretty painful looking attack that surely would have been met with furious demonic retribution if Saturn were left to handle the situation on his own. There's even a mid-shot panel of Saturn immediately after the kick where he's all like, "Really? I mean, that was unnecessary. Kinda had things under control there, Kizaru. I am an elder star and all, but thanks anyway." So again, at the moment, I don't think Kizaru's going to do a full flip, but there's definite emotional conflict happening here. And the general theme with every Admiral character is them coming to terms with justice and questioning the decisions of those they serve. Fujitora, for one, was always pursuing his own justice, even if it involved directly thwarting the world government. In fact, especially if it involved that. Meanwhile, the goodest of boys, Fleet Admiral Sakazuki, has been struggling with the lack of resources to implement his sense of justice, as well as enthusiasm from the Five Elders. And then, of course, Kuzan left the Marines in pursuit of his own ideals. So it's time to challenge Kizaru as well. And much like Kuzan on Ohara, I think that Kizaru might have a sneaky impact that results in the crew being able to escape. Otherwise, what we have right now is a 2-on-2. Sanji and Frankie versus Kizaru and Saturn. Not an amazing matchup. So we really need Luffy back in the picture right about now, which is exactly what Oda didn't do. In fact, Oda went out of his way to take Luffy out of the picture he was already in. The main character of this manga didn't appear in any pictures this week, despite the fact that he was right there in the midst of the action in the last chapter. Luffy was suspiciously absent, only mentioned in a single panel where the Marine stated that he disappeared, which is a very un-Luffy-like thing to do. And this might just be some more swamp cope on my part, but Karibo could have absorbed him and give Luffy the opportunity for some sort of sneak attack. At this point, I'm just not sure what else could be going on with Luffy. We have the mystery food and now the mystery disappearance. So if not swamp, then what? But in response to everything, Saint Saturn has more or less said, F it, we're just going to solve this problem the same way that we, the world government, solve every other problem. Mass destruction and or genocide. So he orders a busticle, and fair play to him because there's a lot of problems currently happening on Egghead Island. Saturn cites that they've been researching the Void Century, also the last rogue buccaneer and an Emperor of the Sea who was taken on the form of an ancient god prophesied to bring down their entire world order. So if I was faced with all of those problems, I would be very keen to solve them with a series of violent explosions. But the thing to keep in mind is that this is not an ordinary busticle. This isn't O'Hara and this is not any Sobby. Both of those situations were horrific, but they were subject to a normal busticle, which consists of 10 marine battleships. But on Egghead Island, we have 100 ships. That's 10 times the firepower of a regular busticle, as well as an admiral, an elder star, and a gaggle of bonus vice admirals that would normally be there. And we should also briefly spare a thought for Nico Robin, because this is now the third busticle that's been initiated directly on her. Most people don't live beyond their first busticle, but this is Robin's third in 30 years. That's an average of a busticle once every decade. So will Nico Robin go on to survive this busticle? Well, yes, obviously, it's a story, but the question is more, how will she survive it this time? I can't wait to find out, and you'll know as soon as I do, so long as you press that subscribe button for consistent injections of One Piece culture administered directly into your YouTube feeds. Never has elder abuse gotten me this hyped before. That's true. In fact, you know what? For a series with such an emphasis on the power of the elderly, we've had almost no geriatric antagonists until Saturn's appearance on Egghead. The closest I can think of would be Big Mom, who's 68 years old, so not quite in the range of true elder yet, but also she has the mind of a child, so I tend to view punching her as more akin to child abuse. We also had Whitebeard, but I wasn't cheering for him to get hit. In fact, I wanted him to hit others, so in that case, I wanted to see the elderly abusing. The biggest takeaway from this chapter is that the Straw Hats will have to completely eliminate Cell's style, the Gorosei, in order to defeat them. It does seem to be going that way. In case you're somehow not a Dragon Ball fan, Cell was a villain who could regenerate his entire body from a single cell alone. So to beat him, you needed to completely erase every trace of his existence. And in the Dragon Ball world, that's actually not such a huge problem because they have access to all of the big energy blasts. Pew. But for someone like, say, Luffy, it's a huge problem. He doesn't fight with that sort of destructive power. He's more about blunt force submission. And Luffy has fought opponents with regeneration effects before, mainly Logia users and Katakuri, but Saint Saturn is on a very different scale. With other pirates and generally more human identifying figures, Luffy is able to mentally break them just as much as physically breaking them. But Saturn and the other gaggle of old men aren't the kind of people you can ideologically shift into future allies. So I don't know if they can be beaten in a traditional One Piece manner, and I do think that by the end of the series, their existence will be eradicated from this planet, Cell style. I wouldn't bet on Luffy or any of the Straw Hats to be the ones to necessarily implement that though, because it seems to be the running theme with the higher-ups of the world government is them defeating themselves. It's defeat via hubris. All of their greatest problems are completely their own creation. Like the example of Gear 5th Luffy. If not for ordering Guernica to interrupt the fight on Onigashima, Luffy may never have awakened the Nika fruit. So in terms of an ultimate defeat, I'm thinking they might even get hit with their own super weapon that destroyed Leloucia. That or perhaps Pluton, but something equally as destructive and initiated by themselves. One of the trickiest things I've always found with the ancient weapons is that it's hard to come up with a reason for our heroes to use them. I mean, there's a theory about using them to break the red line, which is pretty cool, but as an actual weapon, I can't see Luffy ever going, "Hey, Nakama, let's blow the crap out of that island and murder everyone," even if it's populated exclusively by world nobles. I just don't know if I see Luffy saying that. I think it takes a truly evil presence to be able to pull the trigger on something like Pluton, depending on what you're aiming at. I assume it's usually people. But with Saturn individually, we could be getting a good idea of his durability right now. If he gets caught on Egghead Island, tanking 100 marine ships firing at him all at once, then we're gonna get a pretty solid answer as to exactly what it's going to take to beat these guys. Because I don't know if I see a future where we knock them out and send them all to jail. I think that's too light a punishment. I think they just need to go. I think this was the moment Saint Kuma is finally no longer a slave. His whole life he's done nothing for himself. And now he finally doesn't have to listen and finally got his revenge. Bracket symbolic, but hey, I'm sure Saturn at least felt it, closed brackets. That's a really good way of putting it. Kuma's whole life has been one of slavery, be that literal or more implied by circumstance. He's never truly been free, and it's tragic that what it took for him to be free was to remove everything he was and leave the shell to exercise that freedom. I seriously can't tell if Robin is soon to be the most unlucky or lucky person for surviving 3 buster calls. Alright, so someone else pointed this out to me. Robin has actually survived 4 buster calls if you include the one initiated in One Piece Stampede to bring down Douglas Bullet on Delta Island. But I guess the answer is that Robin is both the luckiest and unluckiest person in the world. If Robin's life was a D20, then every single side of that die would be a 1 or a 20. Kind of reminds me of that guy in the Guinness Book of World Records, Roy Sullivan, who survived 7 lightning strikes between 1942 and 1977 and was referred to as the human lightning conductor. And comparatively, Robin, she's only young, so she's on track for a lifetime record of 7, 8, maybe even 9 buster calls. I wonder if it'll get to the point where Robin just gets bored. It's her 5th or 6th buster call and she has plans that evening, so let's just get it over with like a household chore. But regardless, all I know is when it comes to a buster call, always bet on Nico Robin. So there's also one weird phenomena I want to address, which is that a lot of you, and I mean a lot of you in the review video, were like weirdly certain that Robin had survived a buster call on Sabadi Archipelago as well. And apart from reading the story, the way we can tell that this is not true is because Sabadi Archipelago is still there. If a buster call was ordered on Sabadi, then it would be destroyed. What happened there is that a Marine Admiral and his forces were summoned to Sabadi to apprehend Luffy and the Straw Hats. That's not a buster call. A buster call is a specific directive to destroy an island. But with that in mind, and that's kind of an accidental pun, because I wonder what's going to happen to Vegapunk during this buster call. Because Vegapunk is not just a man. Vegapunk is now technically part of the island itself. So previously the idea was to preserve Punk records, but now the idea is to blow it up. And Punk Records has a fancy name and everything, but it is quite literally Vegapunk's brain. So if we destroy it, do we kill Vegapunk alongside of it? Not many things can live without their brains. Not even Kuma, even his cyborg form still has a brain. He's not allowed to use it, but he does still have it. So to save Vegapunk, we also need to find a way to transport his island-sized brain that would take something like oars to move. Or actually, a much more reasonable solution, Kuma teleports the whole thing away to, say, Elbaf or somewhere else safe, maybe even Momoiro Island. And then a much less reasonable solution, perhaps Caribou could engulf all of Punk Records in glorious swamp, and then we just need to make sure that he survives, because as far as we know, his pocket dimension abilities are limitless. But it has to survive though, right? Even if Vegapunk doesn't, Punk Records somehow does? Because it was Vegapunk's dream to give the whole world access to Punk Records and all of the information. So that's an interesting issue that we're gonna have to deal with now. We've officially hit the obligatory countdown to destruction of the island portion of the arc. Yes, that's definitely fair to point out. One Piece tends to have this reputation of being mind-blowingly unpredictable, but most major arcs follow the exact same story beats, and this is a big one which I call the Doomsday scenario. It doesn't always involve the destruction of an entire island, although quite frequently it does, but something along those lines that means that everyone's gonna die. Like say when the whole of Fishman Island was going to be destroyed by the Noah, and then on Punk Hazard the Doomsday scenario was Caesar's chemical weapon, on Dressrosa Doflamingo was going to kill everyone with the birdcage, on Whole Cake Island everyone was also going to die if they failed to defuse Big Mom's hunger tantrum, and on Wano, Onigashima was going to destroy the flower capital. So Saturn activating the Buster Call is an important narrative step that we've been waiting for, and it signals that Egghead is indeed in the deep end and is going to finish very, very soon. Although what's different with Egghead is that in all of those other scenarios we ended up saving the island and the people, but I don't think we're saving this one. This feels more like any Slobby where we just leave the island behind and in a state of destruction. Doesn't this Buster Call implies that the island-destroying weapon that they used on the Lucia possibly has some sort of restrictions / cooldown? So it definitely does, and we have a good idea of exactly what that is, because it's very implied to be powered by a substance that Vegapunk created called the Mother Flame, which is why the world government were trying so hard to preserve Egghead Island. Not hard enough, because Saturn's just kind of let that go for now. So the weapon has a limited fuel source, and after the test conducted on the Lucia, it may not have enough Mother Flame remaining to initiate another attack. Also, maneuverability could be a problem. We have no idea how long it takes to position the weapon, so utilizing a nearby marine fleet may be the only option in this particular case. If Kuma had sex with Ginny, that means Bonnie saw it. That's true, but he didn't. At least we did. No, he didn't. And you know, I've never thought about it this way until now, but Bartholomew Kuma is probably the only person whose entire life's memories can be shown to a child and not contain any sort of, how shall we say, adult material along those lines. Like, he's not the kind of pastor who would have healed the elderly and then popped back into the rectory for a quick wank. This guy was ridiculously pure. Not a drop of lust to be seen, or really any of the traditional bad sin things. I mean, apart from wrath, there were a couple of occasions where Kuma got just a little bit angry. But other than that, and all of the slavery, Bonnie probably has the least traumatic experience of any child who would be forced to watch their parents' entire memories. With Esper being a clone of Kuma, he may also have that unique Buccaneer trait, which could have been implemented into the other Seraphim like Lunarian DNA. This is probably my favorite comment of the week, because I think that you, person who wrote it, are bang on. We're definitely losing Kuma during this arc if we haven't already. He will be the last Buccaneer born outside of a lab. However, we do have his DNA, and it lives on through Esper and potentially the other Seraphim as well. Within that DNA is the special trait of the Buccaneer race, the one that allowed Kuma to continue moving and making decisions even after a full body shutdown. And if every other Seraph is being created with Buccaneer DNA, then they all theoretically have this special trait as well. Vegapunk in this chapter mentions the power of love, and look, we don't know how cryptic he's being. But when it comes to the Seraphim, the one we've seen act of her own volition the most is S-Snake, and the reason why is because she's in love with Luffy. However, just like Kuma, they're all currently bound by a command program. So there's only so much they can do, if anything. But now, after seeing Kuma, that could give Vegapunk the bright idea to initiate the same thing within the Seraphim. To give them all free will, ironically by shutting down all of their functions, but thus activating that special Buccaneer gene. Although that would be quite a dangerous thing to do. So you've got S-Bear, S-Shark, and S-Snake who would be amazing allies. But the rest of the Seraphim might go in some pretty terrible directions if given free will. I'm thinking specifically about you, S-Flamingo. Although if it is directly linked to love, then that could be an important part of the equation as well. So S-Snake, no worries, we know what her agenda is. S-Bear, also no worries, that dude loves everything. But I wonder what it is that the rest of the original 7 warlords love. And this could even lead to some pretty enlightening stuff. But even if any of this was a possibility, Vegapunk only has access to 4 of the 7. So Crocodile, Flamingo, and Bat and/or Gecko will probably remain under world government control. Of course, the other idea behind the Buccaneer trait goes back to this arc's discussion around the soul. The idea that even though we physically removed about as much of Kuma as we could, the only thing that couldn't be dissected was the soul. And that in addition to physical endurance, the Buccaneer race also possesses incredible spiritual endurance. Something like a more literal incarnation of the will of D living on. The souls of the Buccaneer people still being able to impact the world after death. It sounds like a bit of a big crazy jump, but souls in the afterlife aren't exactly new concepts in One Piece, nor is the idea of souls inhabiting and interacting with the living realm. Brook proves that on his own, but he's not a one-off either, because Big Mom was able to produce this effect en masse. And maybe it's not the soul, but whatever happens, we're looking deeper here. There is something special beyond the body unique to the Buccaneer people. Shanks is finally back in the cover page. Seems he is proposing to York. Alright, so this probably makes no sense to the vast majority of people watching this video, but for the past year or so, there's been a meme going around on the internet accusing Shanks of being a rat, an agent of the world government, feeding cheese-sized portions of information to the 5 elders. And whilst I completely disagree with this idea, I love all of the memes that come out of it, with my favorite being One Piece film Rat. But long story less long, that's why the commenter claims to have spotted Shanks on the cover page. Also, more rat talk. In the review video, a lot of you commented that Sanji is actually serving mice on the cover page. And well, that's complicated. The scans also refer to them as a mouse couple. And furthermore, I do generally agree that they look more like mice than rats, at least to my uneducated eyes. However, according to the official translation, they're rats. This type of standard Oda drawing have always been referred to as rats. Some of the confusion might stem from the fact that mice and rats have the same name in Japanese. They're both called Nezumi, and the only way to really differentiate between them is to say Chisai Nezumi, as in small rat, small mouse, that, or Oki Nezumi, big rat or big mouse. What if Luffy is being hidden with holograms? Right, so that just reminded me that we're still waiting for the whole hologram thing to pay off. Oda went to this weird amount of detail to establish exactly what the holograms are, as well as to create a device to allow people to interact with them. And one of the big theories we saw at the beginning of Egghead Island was that that device would allow Luffy or Sanji or someone to fight Kizaru a lot easier because he was made of light as well. And funnily enough, that was before we even knew that Kizaru was going to Egghead Island. And even funnily enough, Luffy didn't need it at all to fight him. But maybe holograms are our ticket out of here. Like we create a giant holographic Luffy to distract everyone whilst we scoot out the back. And throughout all of this, Zoro is still fighting against Lucci, and the big ancient robot is still waking up. You know, I often forget that Zoro's fighting Lucci. The last time we saw either of those characters was chapter 1094, so only 10 chapters ago, but 1094 was published on October 9th, 2023. So with all of the breaks, it's been over 3 months since we've seen them. And you know, I'm looking forward to seeing Lucci again because I'm keen to see what he thinks about having this Buster Call initiated on him. Actually, I guess it wouldn't be the first time, but what I'm looking for is Lucci's limit, if it exists. From Saturn's perspective, both Lucci and Kaku are more than disposable, so is there a point where they start prioritizing themselves? Especially with an injured Kaku, he can't do a whole lot on his own right now, so he's either relying on Lucci or the Straw Hats to get him out of this. I feel like there's so much we've left in the backgrounds though, which is crazy because Egghead feels like it could end in the snap of a finger. We are so close to the climax, but also more things. As the commenter said, we still have the Iron Giant to deal with, which we last saw in mid-September 2023. I feel like sometimes it's easier to say the release date than the chapter numbers, because seeing that big boy wake up, that was a huge cliffhanger, and one that we've been dangling from for a third of a year now. And I think it would be amazing if the Iron Giant arrived and did exactly what Kuma did, punched Saturn, but with a much bigger fist. And hey, if the Kuma Soul idea pans out, then maybe the reason why he's not moving anymore is because he sees an opportunity to inhabit a much more effective vessel. But that's the big X factor left to deal with on Egghead. But that and the Blackbeard Pirates. Oh my god, the Blackbeard Pirates. Although there is a conspiracy theory that says that Katarina Devon is already on the island. Several actually, but here's the most logical one. And this is because in chapter 1092, we have this panel of Nami where we can see her tattoo nice and clear. However, the next time we get a clear shot of her arm is chapter 1094. And would you look at that? A completely bare arm. I think there's a 99.9% chance that this was just a continuity error. Oda does stuff like this all the time, with one of the most infamous examples being when he accidentally drew Luffy's scar on Zoro. I mean, that's a pretty egregious example because that's not forgetting anything, that's remembering something but applying it to the wrong character. But look, if this is Katarina Devon, then I will give Oda all of the credit in the world for subtly planting it, and if it isn't, then what I'm going to do is give him a dismissive for this minor error. And to be the first to know the outcome of this dramatic situation, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for consistent injections of One Piece culture administered directly into your YouTube feeds. Someone else is showing up to Egghead Island. Just when we thought this arc was over, done, no more big reveal things, Oda delivers
another one.
To which the readers reply,
"You're joking. Not another one? Oh, for God's sake, I can't."
And the reasonable assumption for this particular another one would be the Blackbeard Pirates. But I actually think it might be someone else, and I'll tell you exactly who that is in a bit. Because we need to start things proper with the announcement that both Saint Saturn and Kizaru will be remaining on Egghead Island over the course of the Buster Call, which makes sense. Theoretically, neither of them can actually be harmed by a Buster Call, so why not? But it's also a move that I really like from Saturn. As a villain, I am rapidly growing to appreciate him more and more with every chapter, because in this case, he's not doing the tired trope of just assuming that his evil plan is going to succeed. He's not ordering the Buster Call and then washing his hands of the situation, just assuming that it'll succeed. Saturn knows there's a chance that this won't be enough, and so he's going to stay to finish the job. Good man. I mean, bad man, but good decision making. Also known as that thing that Crocodile should have done on Alabasta when he gutted Luffy with his hook, or like that thing that Crocodile should have done on Alabasta when he buried Luffy in quicksand, or like that thing Crocodile should have done on Alabasta when he drained Luffy of all of his life fluids. If he'd stayed put for even a couple of seconds, he would have seen the water fall back down and revive Luffy. It's like Crocodile was mentally and physically immune from finishing what he started. But Saturn is not that, which is very exciting, because it means that Saturn has taken another step towards a bit of an all-in here. It's becoming much more likely that we'll actually see him defeated, and I think it would be glorious if at least part of that defeat was caused by the Buster Call that he himself ordered. On to Kizaru. Look, I'm just going to be blunt. In this chapter, he is pathetic. There's this one panel in particular I'm talking about, and you already know exactly what the panel I'm referring to is. This is the most meek panel of Kizaru I've ever seen. In fact, it's the most meek panel of any Marine Admiral I think I've ever seen, because he looks like a dog who's been told off for urinating on the carpet. Bad boy, bad. Like, he knows he's done a bad thing, but he can't change it, and so all he has left is shame. Lots and lots of puddles of shame. Honestly, even Green Bull running from Shanks is less pathetic than this Kizaru, because at least Green Bull did the hockey maths and decided that it wasn't going to be a good outcome. He didn't betray his own sense of justice and morality, whatever they may be, but here Kizaru is just, well, he's broken. And a few chapters back, someone in my comments pointed out the salaryman theory, which is that all of the Marine Admirals admirals, or at least all of the original Marine admirals, are stereotypes based on Japanese salarymen. Kuzan's the guy who gets fed up with his job and quits. Sakazuki is the one who fully embraces company culture and dedicates his life to endless promotions and fulfillment of their goals. And then you've got Kizaru, the man whose spirit is gradually broken over decades and decades of service and ends up not really being able to function as an individual because that's all been stripped away by the corporate homogeny. So now he's just a soulless tool to be used by the company, that company being the world government. A metaphorical representation of what Bartholomew Kuma was literally intended to be. But as it turns out, even the hollow shell of Bartholomew Kuma has more willpower than Kizaru. I'm not even angry at him, I'm just disappointed, depressingly so. I think it's one thing to choose the wrong thing because it personally benefits you. It's a dick move, but at least something is gained. But this doesn't even benefit Kizaru. He's doing something that he doesn't want to do. And all because he's too weak-willed to even make a single decision for himself. And you know, maybe that's why we've yet to see Kizaru make a strong display of any type of haki. We know he can use both observation and armament, but even after a full fight with Luffy, we have very little demonstration of it. And perhaps that's because if haki is the quantification of willpower, and Kizaru has very little of that, then he can't really use much of it. And there is no way that he's a conqueror's haki user. At least not with this attitude of servitude. Although actually, I don't think that any admiral is a confirmed conqueror's user at this stage. Not even Sakazuki. Right now, Sengoku is the only confirmed person who's ever held the rank of admiral to be a user of conqueror's haki. But look, I feel like I've accidentally slipped into a bit of a Kizaru rant. I did not expect him to be this pathetic. It's a very interesting twist on a character in his position, and I don't hate it. I'm always a fan of more character depth no matter what direction we go in. I just feel sorry for him and everyone else who gets harmed because he's too afraid to stand up to the system that he knows is wrong. And all he's going to do is stand there in his puddle of piss. But this system is currently doing some very wrong things because there's quite a bleak panel of Vegapunk alone in the frame, watching Egghead Island crumble around him. There's no dialogue or anything like hugely flashy happening in the panel. It's just us watching as a man's life's work is slowly destroyed in front of him. And you just know that's the reason why Saint Saturn hasn't killed Vegapunk yet. At this stage, there's no logical reason for him to still be alive. He's there, you can kill him, no one can stop you. He's standing helpless in front of Saturn and Kizaru, both of whom could erase his existence in a snap of a finger. But I think that Saturn is deliberately holding back the order to kill Vegapunk because he's taking pleasure in Vegapunk's despair. Saturn wants Vegapunk to see everything he's worked for be destroyed. He wants Vegapunk to know that all of his efforts will be for nothing, hence why he mentioned the evacuation ship. And he also wants Vegapunk to ideally witness the deaths of Bonnie and the others. Then and only then, after Vegapunk has lost absolutely everything, will Saturn give him permission to die. That is the kind of guy Saturn is. It's not good enough just to take the most efficient path to victory. No, he needs to inflict as much pain and suffering on his target as possible, which is why at the end of this chapter he's practically creaming his spider pants at the thought of Bonnie being killed by Pacifista. Because in this moment, he's outdone himself. He's found a way for the daughter of a loving father to be killed by a representation of said father. He's not just killing Bonnie, he's finding the most twisted possible way to do it so that he can go back and brag to his geriatric friends about it when he gets back to the evil retirement home. The great thing about this is that it continues to place Saturn, and by extension the others, on a whole different level of antagonist to what we've previously seen, which we really need for the final saga. These need to be true pinnacle villains. But in terms of writing, it also gives Oda permission to do stupid things like keep Vegapunk alive for now, which will almost certainly come back to bite Saturn. His lust for cruelty will be his downfall. But back to Vegapunk's despair, that panel of him staring helplessly at Egghead's destruction reminds me a lot of this panel from Robin's flashback, where you've got Robin, Olvia, Sol, and Professor Clover helplessly watching the Tree of Knowledge burn down. And the main concerns of all of the scholars in this moment was preserving the information they gathered to be passed on to the next generation. Not one of them had a single shred of concern for their own life. They were mostly worried that their work wouldn't go on to change the world, which is the exact situation that Vegapunk is in right now. He's being faced with the reality that he may not be able to create the utopia he's been working towards. And if the O'Hara parallels continue, what happened next is that both Clover and Olvia were seemingly killed when the Tree of Knowledge collapsed. I say allegedly because we don't see it happen. Like, we see the tree collapse, but we don't see them die. It's just assumed that they died, in the same way that it was assumed for the longest time that Sol died. Although I'd say there's a much stronger chance of Olvia having died at least, because if not, then she's got some explaining to do for why she never set out to find Robin. But they died making sure that that knowledge would be passed on. And I would expect Vegapunk to do exactly the same. His survival is not his personal priority, and I have no doubt that he will find a way to preserve at least some, if not most, of the Egghead research, but the question is, at what cost? And the answer is his life. His life is the cost, probably. Although Egghead Island could also be the anti-O'Hara, where this time we're able to find a way to have a much less tragic outcome. Maybe. I don't know. I've got to be honest, I'm not feeling amazing about it at the moment. But then again, usually when we have Luffy on our side, things have a way of working out for the best. And speaking of, we do catch up with Luffy again, but rather annoyingly, it answers none of our questions and in fact only creates another one. So the Marines have found Luffy gorging himself in front of one of the food replicators. And so the question now becomes not who fed him, but who moved him there to continue to be fed. This has gone beyond simple Uber Eats. In this case, the driver didn't just deliver food to Luffy, he, she, or it delivered Luffy to food. I really don't think it was Luffy himself who made the conscious decision to move here. From everything we've seen of him, he's barely conscious to begin with, and he has no energy whatsoever to be making decisions about his own life. And we're seriously running out of candidates, because we can now quite definitively cross Kizaru off the list. A lot of people were big fans of the lightspeed food delivery idea, and we can also cross Atlas off, firstly because she said she couldn't move before, and secondly because she definitely hasn't had the opportunity to move Luffy since because she's been busy carrying Kuma. And at this point, it just has to be him, right? I always throw Swamp Nakuma's name into the arena as a bit of a gag, but from the very beginning of the Feeder Luffy saga, he's been the most reasonable conclusion. Unless there's someone on the island that we as readers are unaware of, it surely has to be Caribou. Because in this chapter we catch up with all of the Straw Hats, or at least we hear what all the Straw Hats are doing. Zoro is still fighting Lucci and they're sending Jinbei, not to help Zoro, but so that he doesn't get lost, which was funny. But we also catch up with all the remaining satellites. Except York, I guess. But that would be incredibly unlikely. So at this moment, all signs point to Swamp. He knows that Luffy is powered by food, he knows that Luffy is the only chance he has of getting off this island alive, and he's also the only one with the Devil Fruit ability that can be so sneaky. Even here in this panel, Caribou could be there, cowered in a puddle of his own making, because he's terrified of being spotted by the Marines. Whoever or whatever it is, I do wish Oda would stop teasing us. Once is one thing, but he's made us ask this same question now 3 chapters in a row. But luckily, he does also give us a brand new question to ponder, because at the end of the chapter, some new players have arrived. And there's a lot of fun ideas as to who they are. The most obvious conclusion would be the Blackbeard pirates because we've already seen one of their ships lurking ominously around Egghead. However, there's a timeline question with that because the destroyed marine ship we see was sent to pursue the citizens who were evacuated yesterday, meaning that they had time to get far away. So it's hard to know how far away this new presence actually is from Egghead and at what point in time we're seeing the destroyed marine ship. They could be right here and now, or they could be hours, maybe even a day away given the timeline. However, given the fact that this island is going to be reduced to rubble in minutes, I'd say that they probably need to be pretty damn close to make a difference. Because despite our new arrivals, this chapter ends in quite a dire way. At the moment, we have at least 3 life-threatening problems that need immediate solutions. And one that I haven't covered yet is the situation with Brook and Lilith. They're a very fun duo, by the way. I always love it when Brook is paired with an equally, if not more crazy character, because he takes that energy and he runs with it. Brook is such a perfect companion to anyone. And he's proving once again why he's such an MVP to the crew, because he's able to use his vast library of weird techniques to freeze the cloud so that the Thousand Sunny can slide on it. But the dire situation here that Brook and Lilith now face is that neither of them can actually stop the ship. It's moving, but it's going to fall off the clouds imminently and probably down to the main part of the island, where Sunny will be at the mercy of the Buster Call. So that's one problem to solve. The other is that Luffy is currently surrounded by Marines and he's personally unable to do anything about that, but we've already covered that. And the third is this really cool perspective shot of everyone falling because Kizaru cut them out of the vacuum rocket, and not just falling, but being targeted by every pacifista in the area. So that's a case of double death, getting shot by a pacifista and the impact of the fall. This situation needs to be solved within like the next second or so. In fact, that goes for all 3 of our desperate situations. One small detail I do like about this dire falling panel is that you can see that Kuma is still capable of moving because he appears to have grabbed Bonnie. So he's not quite gone yet, but for him to move, it looks like Bonnie needs to be in immediate death danger. But this is the thing that makes me question if our new arrivals are the Blackbeard pirates, because I don't see them stepping in to solve any of these problems for us. They're not our allies, and actually, they'd probably be thrilled to see the collapse of another Emperor of the Sea. I should note that Sanji is also available to do something. He's right below the falling group and has the handy ability to skywalk, but then again, there's a lot of big people falling. You've got Frankie, he's big. You've got Atlas, she's bigger, and you've got Kuma, the biggest. And Sanji, he's a strong boy, but he just doesn't have the arm space to scoop up all of those titans. So I'm gonna suggest an unlikely, probably very unlikely, but fun option. Could this be the arrival of the Straw Hat Grand Fleet? Because those are the kind of numbers that we need on Egghead right now. There's a fleet of 100 marine ships, and a force of 5,000 loyal pirates would be mighty useful to cause enough chaos for us to escape right now. And there's enough of them to split into teams and help solve these problems simultaneously. Like say Brook and Lilith falling and Bartolomeo creates a barrier that guides Sunny into the sea, stuff like that. Maybe Hakuba slices the Marines attacking Luffy, stuff like that. But I say this is unlikely because I don't know if this is the event we've been waiting for with the Grand Fleet, and their presence here doesn't really fit the arc thematically. Although we have been told that they would create a quote, incident of historic proportions, and so far this has been referred to as the Egghead Incident. And also the narrator has said that the resolution of this incident the following day would inflict a kind of shock the world never saw coming. And it would be pretty shocking if an Elder Star, perhaps even a Marine Admiral, were defeated here. Can't deny that. Maybe even the death of Vegapunk as well. More shock. But my main question would be why now and when did they have the time to mobilize? Word did get out that Luffy had taken Egghead Island and that there would be a siege, which would give the Grand Fleet a reason to move maybe, because unlike Wano, they'd actually know that something was happening. But they'd all have to get there within like half a day. And that's probably possible for someone like Harudin, who is next door on Elbaf, but we have no idea where the rest of the crew are. But my other solution to at least one of the problems is the Iron Giant. That guy could quite easily save all of the characters currently falling to their deaths, or stop the ship with Brook and Lilith, or maybe even terrify the Marines away from surrounding Luffy. That's the thing though, it can solve one of these problems, but not all three. And people are inevitably going to mention the Revolutionary Army as a possibility. They'd be more thematically appropriate than the Grand Fleet, given that this is all about Kuma. And there's even a fun meme on Twitter at the moment, having a bit of a laugh at all of the theories that Dragon was going to show up on Egghead Island, as well as all of the cope it's been inspiring since. But the Revolutionary Army are pretty much the only people we can be certain that it's not. Because Bartholomew Kuma was with the Revolutionary Army, and he only just got here, using his crazy teleportation powers. So the Revolutionary Army would need to be able to move faster than Kuma, and cross the red line to get here. And even if they could, the last time we saw him, Dragon didn't look like he was in any particular rush to do anything, as per usual. And we've even got Morley in the background doing a bit of a yak. Hardly preparations for battle. So you let me know in the comments, who do you think is showing up on Egghead? And possibly more excitingly, do you think that Oda will actually show them in the next chapter? Or is this a mystery that he's going to leave dangling for a month or two like most other cliffhangers? It's got to be the Grand Fleet. They probably wanted to find Luffy after becoming an emperor. They wanted to celebrate, but now got caught up in the battle. So I've been thinking a lot about this since the review video, and I'm a lot more conflicted now. Because one problem is that I think the Grand Fleet are waiting for a specific call or signal from Luffy, or at least that's how Luffy made the arrangement sound. Listen, I just want to be the Pirate King, that's all. I don't want to be some kind of big shot. If I ever think we're in trouble, I'll shout for your help. Then you can come save us. However, the counter-argument to that would be how the Grand Fleet, well, interpreted those words. They took Luffy's desire for a no-strings-attached pirate arrangement as a sign that they didn't actually have to listen to him. Sai even says, you can't stop free people doing what they want, which is when they decide to non-consensually form Luffy's Grand Fleet. And with that same logic, you can't stop free people from deciding to either show up and help you or celebrate your accomplishments. And something I should say, because I did miss it in the review video, is that the Grand Fleet have had quite a bit of time to mobilize due to what happened on Wano. Luffy's near-death/arguable actual death experience should have been noticed, because they all have a bit of his Vivia card and it would have done, the fire catchy thing. So they could have been on their way to find him ever since the night of the raid. Although the last we heard of Bartolomeo was from Shanks in chapter 1054, which made it sound like Bartolomeo was still causing a bit of the old trouble in Shanks' territory, which was happening a week after the raid. So Bartolomeo was theoretically still screwing around in Shanks' territory a week after Luffy's dire near/actual death situation. That or Shanks is working with old information and Bartolomeo has long since left his territory. It's 100% Mads, Germa 66 coming to save Vegapunk. So I actually don't hate this idea, although it's interesting that you've chosen to use the word save, whereas I would have said something more like they're coming to take revenge on Vegapunk. It feels like an eternity ago, but during Egghead Island, we've also been following the Germa 66 cover story, which ultimately led to the formation of Neo Mads. The reason why it feels like an eternity is is because this cover story ended way back in chapter 1078, which was released in March 2003. So we've had almost a year now without a new cover story, and I think it's time we started the next one. But the conclusion that Vince Smoke Judge and Caesar Clown came to was that Mads was a fantastic idea that was ruined by Dr. Vegapunk. He's the reason why their ambitions didn't work out. Him and his peace-loving ways. So if they were on their way to Egghead Island, I highly doubt it's to recruit their old comrade. It would be more likely that they were going to invade Egghead Island to claim the research that was rightfully theirs, or something along those lines. But again, I don't hate the idea at all because it's very thematically appropriate. We've been telling the story of Mads during this arc, so it would be a cool way to wrap things up, and Vegapunk isn't even the only Mads member on the island. We also have Stussy, oh well, not the original one, but we have a Buckingham Stussy, a Neo Stussy if you will. So if Judge and Caesar did rock up, then we'd have a big old Mads reunion that's really only missing Queen. Let's say it isn't them though, they've still got to be plotting something right now. And what do you think the odds are that Caesar and Judge go to recruit Queen? In the cover story, Judge, Caesar, and Queen were said to be the three bitter rivals, fighting amongst themselves to see who would become the number two. And look, to be fair, each of them did go on to become a number two in their own respective ways. But if Caesar and Judge have put that past behind them, then they would probably see Queen in the same sort of friendly way. It was never Queen's fault, it was that Vegapunk. And really, Queen's not exactly doing much at the moment. He's potentially being captured by the Marines and he has no Kaido to serve. So he would be a great addition to the Neomads team. The ship is on fire and Sabo wasn't with the rest of the Rev army, so my bet is Sabo. Alright, it really astounds me how quick people are to forget things. I mean, yeah, I get it. It's One Piece. It's very tricky to keep track of, with all of its billions of characters and locations and the timelines that are confusing. I get it. And also, this was one of like 20 comments saying exactly the same thing. But Sabo was with the rest of the Revolutionary Army. We saw him return to Momoira Island in chapter 1082 to report the Reverie incident, which is how we got the whole Reverie flashback. And Sabo's return to the island happened after Kuma left. Sabo even said, "I heard about what happened with Kuma," and Dragon replies, "I'm sorry I wasted all of your hard work." Which is even more evidence that Dragon is not on his way. Kuma disappeared and then they went, "Oh, what should we do now? Oh, let's sit down and have a bit of a long chit chat with Sabo." A very important chit chat, of course, very important. But none of these guys are on the move. And a lot of people are saying that it's Sabo and Dragon because the Marine ship is on fire and you can see a gust of wind. But so many other people and things can make fire, and wind is, well, it's everywhere. Except in the calm belt, that's why it's so calm. So let's move on. Who else could it be? I think it could be Shanks. So logistically, this is very possible. Shanks has been shown on Elbaf in the last 24 hours, so he's definitely nearby. In fact, other than the Blackbeard pirates, he's the closest confirmed character to Egghead Island at this point. And he was sailing away from Elbaf yesterday, I think, after beating Kid, so there's no timeline issues. Everything lines up quite nicely there. But I feel like Shanks showing up might be a bit underwhelming. Firstly, because it would be almost like a repeat of the Paramount War. Everything's going to hell, everyone's going to die, and then some dude with red hair rocks up and says, "Hey, stop that," and we do it because he said it. But also the issue would be then that the big story behind the Egghead incident would have to have Shanks front and center. And I feel like this event needs to be owned by Luffy. He's an emperor now. We can't have all of these big players stepping in to save him. And also, I'm really not feeling the idea of a potential Luffy-Shanks reunion on Egghead. I don't think Shanks is either. He said he wasn't planning to meet up with Luffy on Wano, so I don't know why Egghead would be any different, and something about it just in general doesn't seem right. And it's also a bit meh considering that they just crossed paths on Wano as well. So I hope it's not Shanks, but he is in the area, so who knows. Imagine if Cross Guild showed up, so Buggy could bumble his way into the infamy of killing Saturn. Oh mate, I can imagine it. Buggy the Clown kills Elder Star, Saint Saturn, and instantly becomes the most wanted man in the world. However, logistically, we do need to do some pretty extreme mental gymnastics to make this in any way a reasonable possibility, so here's the routine I've prepared. The last time we saw Cross Guild, Buggy had announced that they were going to claim the One Piece, essentially forcing both Crocodile and Mihawk into it or else risk losing their power base. And how do we begin a hunt for the One Piece? Well, what we've got to do is find us some mystery cubes, which are being held by the 3 other emperors. And if you're Cross Guild, which emperor do you want to target first? Do you want to go for Shanks? Probably not, because Buggy recognizes himself as very inferior to Shanks, and Mihawk would be very difficult to get on board with that as well. So he's out. Now, do you go for Blackbeard? Also probably not, because he's an unknown quantity whose crew took down the Whitebeard pirates and recently defeated Garp the Hero with the help of an ex-Marine admiral. It's It's not an appealing fight. So who does that leave us with? Well, we've got one choice. We target the Goofball Emperor, who only has a complement of 10 people on his crew to deal with, one of which was trained by Mihawk himself. That's the only way I could see Cross Guild going to Egghead. To use it as an opportunity to strike a vulnerable emperor. But I don't think it's very likely, although it would be funny to see Mihawk's reaction to S-Hawk. But chapter endings like this is what makes and binds this fan base because they have near infinite possibilities. I've even seen a lot of people saying that it could be Law, as if he's gloriously riding Beppo into battle with the Marines after his horrendous loss on Winter Island, which is a fun image, but I think he's got bigger concerns. Nami sending Jinbei to look for Zoro, because she assumed he'd get lost after the fight with Lucci, and not because he needs help, really shows how much the Straw Hats gew. And because this minor spelling mistake was made on the internet, this comment was flooded with replies such as, "The Straw Hats just gew so much. Is gewing time?" and "Ew, you made me gew." So gewing oneself aside, this is a great point. I love that we've reached a level of crew confidence that we're not even considering the possibility of Zoro being in danger when he's up against an antagonist who previously struck the utmost fear into each and every one of them. And you know, something I always love seeing with every chapter is the reaction of general readers versus the reaction of Twitter readers. I feel like what general readers took away from 1105 is the discussion of who is on their way to Egghead Island, whereas what Twitter took away is that MF going full power against mid-power Lucci, Zoro showing off what Advocock KOH Ashura looks like to Lucci. And it's insane because I know what all of those acronyms mean, but it feels like speaking a completely different language. Although I do really love the art that comes out of it, this really is the only thing that saves One Piece Twitter from being completely insufferable. Back in fictional reality though, Zoro really is at the point where his greatest enemy is his own sense of direction, and that's why Nami sent Jinbei. Other than Nami herself, Jinbei has the best sense of direction in the crew. He's the helmsman. He's the one we trust to steer the ship in the right direction. So now we're trusting him to steer Zoro in the right direction. I like how Sanji is taking leadership. I'm surprised you didn't speak about that moment. I don't know, it's cool to see. That's right, he is. Sanji is generally considered to be the default third captain of the crew. If neither Luffy nor Zoro are available, then Sanji is the one who takes charge, which he's definitely doing in this chapter, and it's always great to see. Something I love so much about the Straw Hats is that the crew is completely modular. You can break them up into any number of formations, and more often than not, they will still work together perfectly. There's always this intrinsic sense of who is in charge in any given combination, which is also why I want to highlight the Nami, Usopp, Chopper, Robin group, formerly featuring Jinbei, because in this group formation, Nami would always become the natural leader, even if Robin was in a stable condition, because when everyone's aboard the Sunny, Nami's in charge. Apart from choosing their destination, she has absolute authority, and that often translates to operations on land as well. She's so used to being in command on the ship that with no Luffy, Zoro, or Sanji, she happily steps in. And even if Jinbei were there, Nami would still be in charge. He's wiser and stronger, but Jinbei has great respect for authority and seniority, and Nami is his senior on the crew. Although come to think of it, everyone is Jinbei's senior on the crew. Crazy to think that the most established individual with a book full of career achievements is basically the rookie Straw Hat. Sanji's reply to Bonnie in this chapter is a callback to his reply to Nami on Zoark. I don't know if it's a direct callback, but it is very similar. Bonnie asks what about Vegapunk, and Sanji reassures her that they won't be leaving without him, giving a thumbs up and a bit of a happy face, which is the same face he made when Nami asked why Sanji was going with Capone Gang Beige on Zo. So I don't know if it's a callback so much as a character trait. What I do know is that this is not a comforting face, because I believe that Sanji meant what he said. He left Zo with the intention of coming back to the crew, but it didn't turn out that way, and Sanji quite quickly accepted that he left them for good. So when he makes this same face speaking about Vegapunk, it doesn't instill me with the greatest sense of confidence that we're actually leaving with him. Because I've seen this Sanji face before and it is not trustworthy. It's not like when Luffy says that he's going to do something. Usually when Luffy says that he's going to do something, it's like he changes reality around him to make that something happen. And Sanji doesn't quite have that ability. If it's Caribou fed Luffy, then he would surely join Straw Hats as the Uber Eats of Straw Hats. You know, people laugh and mock the idea of Caribou joining the Straw Hats, people including me. But if he is the one who gave Luffy the food on Egghead, then he would have an official role in no time. It would be crew feeder. I'm just gonna put this out there. With Luffy's two greatest opponents to date, Kaido and Kizaru, Luffy would have outright lost to both of them if he didn't have a mid-fight meal. You could even make the argument that he wouldn't have beaten Katakuri without snacking on all of his delicious mochi, or even Charlotte Cracker, because Luffy got through that endurance battle by eating all of his biscuit armor. Luffy hasn't beaten an opponent without taking taking a meal breaks in Flamingo. So how is Luffy possibly going to defeat someone like the Blackbeard without someone there to feed him? He isn't. It's as simple as that. So we need Swamp Nakama. Or an even better description of his situation, someone in my comments rather poetically described Caribou as like herpes. Once you caught him, you won't get rid of him. This would be the perfect time for Gear 4 Tank Man to make a triumphant return. No, even better. Gear 5th Tank Man. I really miss Tank Man because it holds a very special place of nostalgia for me, because the very first video I ever made on this channel was a review of chapter 832, the one titled Germa Kingdom. The video itself has since been deleted. It was awful, but it was around the time that the Straw Hats were stuck in the forest, and Tank Man popped up I think around 10 chapters later, so very early into my YouTube hobby. But also, given how much I just ranted about how Luffy always needs food, I'm surprised that this form has never been used again, because he meets the requirements for it a lot, and this is a potential option right now because again, Luffy certainly has the prerequisite physique for it. Is it just me, or are all these chapters getting way shorter? This chapter was only like 10 pages, so it's not just you. This chapter was 13 pages, although it definitely feels shorter because 3 of them were double page spreads. I mean, I guess not double page spreads, but whatever this is that Oda does, where one section takes up about 3/4 of 2 pages, that essentially combines 2 pages into one image. With all of the that he does, it makes these 13 pages feel like 10 pages total. And last week was 15 pages, which is also under average. The average amount for a chapter would be 16 to 17 pages, sometimes 18. But unfortunately, 13 to 15 is becoming more common with One Piece in the last few months, and my assumption is that that's because of Oda's eye condition, and him just not physically having the ability to prepare full chapters. And I don't know if that's ever getting better, honestly, and I think this reduced page number every 3 or 4 chapters might just be the new normal, which has interesting impacts for the future of the series, because if you've been keeping up with One Piece Weekly for a number of years now, you'll definitely have noticed that we get less and less chapters every year. And now, in addition to less chapters, we're on a trend of getting shorter and shorter chapters as well. So we're getting less of them and they're smaller, which inevitably, I suppose, makes One Piece last longer because we're moving towards the end at such a reduced pace every year. And that's the option that I'm okay with. The other option that I'd be less okay with is that Oda notices the reduced workflow and has to condense and or cut ideas to keep One Piece moving so that we do one day, maybe one day soon, actually finish the series. Although thankfully it doesn't look like that's what's happening at the moment, because we did just get out of a heavily detailed Kuma flashback, so my hope is that reduced chapters and reduced pages just ends up making One Piece last longer. But that depends on Oda and how keen he is to continue giving his entire life to it. But we'll be here right beside him the whole way forward, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel for consistent injections of One Piece culture administered directly into your YouTube feed. The Egghead incident just got better? ? Full Luffy is back at full power, Bonnie has full control over the army of Pacifista, and we have a ship full of giants decimating those poor Marines. This is a proper Uno reverse. In one chapter, we've gone from the most dire situation possible, and we've gone and flipped it on the world government. Haha. And look, I don't know if I should be doing this, but I'm actually starting to have some hope that Egghead Island might result in a victory. However, we've still got a lot to overcome. Even more so than the giants arriving, the biggest flip in 1106 was Bonnie taking control of all of the Mark III Pacifista. I do feel like this was a twist that most of us saw coming, although I personally always thought it would be an innate Kuma present within each Pacifista that put Bonnie at the top of the hierarchy, rather than Vegapunk actually programming her in. It's a beautiful gesture though. I love the idea that he took a stand here and made sure to solidify Kuma's legacy, to make it so that the one thing his effigies would never harm is Bonnie. It makes me look back on earlier Egghead events, specifically the moment with Police Kuma, and I guess what we have here is Bonnie's unfortunate choice of words, because she was begging Luffy to stop rather than begging the Kuma cop to stop. If Bonnie had said the word stop to him, then he would have. But that's the really sweet part about it. Bonnie's concern wasn't for herself. All she wanted was for her dad to stop getting hurt. So that's why her full focus was on preserving him, and why she never accidentally asserted her command authority. But we finally reached the top of the hierarchy. There's no more strategic command games to play, and you're all probably getting tired of me saying this, but it just doesn't stop being perpetually true. Saint Saturn continues to dig his own grave one shovel at a time. In this case, Saturn didn't didn't even consider for a second that he was not the absolute authority on the island. This is despite the fact that he was bragging to Vegapunk about, "Oh, I'm a scientist as well. I'll notice if you don't do it right." He didn't notice. Some scientist he is. And secondly, he made the arrogant decision to keep the pacifista on Egghead Island during the Busticle with his twisted desire to make sure that Bonnie gets killed by her assorted dads. And now he's facing the consequences. If he'd ordered all of his killing machines away, then they probably wouldn't have been able to hear Bonnie's command. But now Bonnie has authority over, 50 Mark III pacifista units? And I would assume the same goes for Esper as well. If Vegapunk felt the moral need to program the pacifista this way, then surely the same goes for Esper as well. So this actually makes Bonnie one of the single most dangerous people in the world now. Even without Esper having command of 50 Mark III pacifista is the kind of power that can conquer entire nations overnight. Not that Bonnie would do such a thing, but the world government's gonna have a rough time dealing with their own creations. Instead of fighting one mere lonely buccaneer, they've gone and essentially resurrected the entire race to take them down. Now, very kind of them to provide the tools for their own destruction. Now, speaking of destruction, Vegapunk's body is, it's fighting valiantly against the concept, but holding one's internal organs in becomes very difficult when impaled by a demonic spider leg. Again, if Saturn had done this earlier instead of taking the time to rub it in, then maybe Vegapunk wouldn't have had the time to tell Bonnie about the command thing. And you know that Saturn knows it as well, because there's this close-up of him where you can see the cracks of his eyes and the veins on his forehead. Look at those throbbing veins. And if Egghead Island were an internet forum, then this is where someone would inevitably pop up and say, "Are you triggered, bro?" But as glad as I am to see Saturn reaping what he sowed, this is it's a big owl for Vegapunk, possibly an unrecoverable owl, because I know this is One Piece, but this is potentially the beginning of the end for him. I can very much see him going down the Whitebeard path of having lived a full, long life, stacked with achievements, and then passing on the torch to the next generation. At the moment, he's also positioned in the stereotypical dying way, bleeding out on the floor with Bonnie crouching over him. And it's not surprising because Shaka told us from the beginning that Vegapunk was gonna die. Well, I guess he may have meant Shaka, but also potentially Stella, because Shaka is part of Stella who is going to die. Or maybe it was just Shaka. Don't know. The whole 7 people being 1 people thing gets confusing. But if Vegapunk were to die here, then I think he's had a good run. And all of the other hymns can go on and continue his legacy. Now, it's probably taken much longer than it should have, but this chapter gives us the moment we've been waiting for, with Bonnie finally recognizing Luffy as the sun god Nika, who her father told her about. In Bonnie's defense, she's a child. I don't know if I would have put these two things together as a child either. But I loved that one close-up panel of the single tear in Bonnie's eye, because it says so much with so little. Within this one tear is the confirmation that everything her father sacrificed had a purpose that has now been realized. And also, Oda gives us a close-up of Kuma's shell, conveniently positioned as if he's looking up at the sky. Which is curious, because in the previous shot we have of Kuma, he's on his knees on the rubber ground. So when I first saw the close-up, I thought it was a shot of Kuma lying down on his back, as if he'd fallen and landed on his back. That's not the case. He's on his knees. So Kuma is on his knees looking up at the sky, almost as if in prayer. And there's a lot of speculation about this little spark on his head, because this sort of visual language is often used in manga, and specifically in One Piece, to convey a sudden realization, as if Kuma has just fully registered and confirmed Nika for the first time. Although I think it could just be an electrical effect as well, because that's the part of his head that got blown away by Sakazuki. Either way, it's a powerful moment, because I'm not religious, but from Bonnie's and I suppose Kuma's perspective, this is a seminal moment of seeing God, which I think is reinforced by Vegapunk completely dismissing the Busticle. Because if you saw your God appear in the flesh, then yeah, what conjuring of mankind is going to be able to do anything against that? What weapon do you have that could possibly combat all of this sheer joy? And you know, if you think about Egghead from Luffy's track alone, he's not really been present for all of the big hard-hitting dramas, which is fairly common in One Piece. Luffy doesn't need more reasons to fight. He sometimes acquires them, like when Tama wants to eat and she's not allowed to. Even though it's a very basic reason. He doesn't quite understand the full complexity of the Kozuki legacy, and he doesn't need to. It really just needs to be as simple as, hey, you didn't let the little girl eat, or hey, you hurt my navigator. Not good. And in a way, that's pretty perfect, because it allows him to be more carefree and liberated from the dramatic burden. He doesn't dwell on specific twisted acts. Like, he knows what's happening is serious, but that's no reason to stop having fun. Although I will admit it's a pretty stark contrast when we have that beautiful panel of Bonnie seeing the classic Nika jump, and you've got Luffy up in the sky having the time of his life whilst the island is burning down around him and Vegapunk is bleeding out on the floor. And I have seen some people complaining on the internet, imagine that, complaining that Luffy isn't taking the situation seriously enough. Bad main character, bad. But at the same time, that's what Joy Boy is. He's not really angry and angsty boy. Joy Boy is always smiling no matter what. Even in the most dire situation, when you're dying on the floor and the world around you is collapsing, there the Joy Boy is, representing that there is still hope and that it's not entirely out of reach. That is what Luffy is. And he's not exactly slacking off whilst doing it either. I mean, the dude knocked an admiral out of the sky like he was swatting a fly. And to use the environmental awakening to save everyone, which was so cool. It was such an obvious but brilliant idea. If you can't stop people hitting the ground, then just make the ground rubber. Easy fix. But what I love most is the Marines watching from the ships and just seeing the whole of Egghead Island shake like a big thing of jelly. It must be such a surreal experience. But Luffy mentions that he's back at full power after his degustation. So it looks like we're set up for a potential round 2 with Luffy versus Kizaru, because it doesn't look like anyone else on the island is capable of standing up to him. I mean, Frankie and Sanji, they've been doing their best, but they're clearly outclassed here. Although, if you look at the panel where Kizaru is attacking the falling group, it looks like Frankie did get struck by the attack, but to Sanji's credit, he managed to block it. And furthermore, it looks like he deliberately positioned himself to intercept any attacks aimed at Bonnie. So good on him. For the last many chapters, he's been the only member of the monster trio active on the front lines. So I definitely feel the need to express some Sanji appreciation. But looking at all of the things that are happening, it's probably about time that Saint Saturn did something, because this situation is rapidly spiraling out of his control and we are nowhere, and I mean nowhere, done with the bad news for him yet. Part of this has to do with what I'm going to call a pretty blue balls moment in this chapter for sure, and I think we all know what it is. After that insanely hyped cliffhanger months and months ago featuring the Iron Giant waking up, we finally catch up with it again, and in this chapter he's just chilling. Dude heard the drums of liberation and said, 5 more minutes, and then 5 more after that, and so on and so forth until he's late for work, which he is. We could really use his help right now, but you know what, that's fine, because his giant co-workers Dory and Broggy are picking up the slack. We'll get to them soon. But the fact that the giant is struggling to wake up makes me wonder exactly what it is he needs to fully power. Luffy being in gear 5th and hearing the drums of liberation on their own are not enough. It's almost like we need an entire orchestra playing the various sounds of liberation over a loudspeaker to give our robot friend the power to get up. Although the Iron Giant does raise an interesting parallel with Kuma. And in fact, the Iron Giant is on the same 2-page section as Kuma on his knees looking up at Luffy. So we've got these two robotic shells reacting to Luffy, taking on a life that neither should have access to. So perhaps our Iron Giant has some sort of connection to the Buccaneer race, and whatever that special trait is that will be revealed eventually, maybe. So, speaking of giants, I always expected that we would be going to Elbaf. What I did not expect was Elbaf coming to us. I said last week that one of the reasons why I love One Piece so much is that cliffhangers can have almost infinite possibilities that leads to endless organic discussion. And this is the best proof of that, because the vast majority of people, including myself, were way off. If you told me last week that you thought that Dory and Broggy were coming to Egghead, then I would have dismissed that as terrible fanfiction. But here they are, and it's perfect. And you know, something I've never really thought about with Dory and Broggy is how out of time they are. They've been fighting on Little Garden for almost 102 years. Whole empires have risen and fallen in the time it's taken them to settle a squabble. Something else to keep in mind is that Dory and Broggy are 160 years old each, which means that they're in the prime of their lives. They're not in their adolescent 80s like Harudin, nor are they in their 300 plus elderly years like Jorul and Jarul. Dory and Broggy are smack back in the time period where a giant is in peak physical condition. And not only that, but they are coming to Egghead fresh from 102 years of non-stop training. These poor Marines are so screwed. I mean, what does anyone even do against Hakoku sovereignty? Bringing 100 ships to Egghead Island is almost doing us a favor, because the sheer number of them makes them easier to line up and destroy in a single attack. I can't help but feel slightly called out by their dialogue though, because the Marines are quite rightfully surprised and asking, why are the giants here? We didn't predict this. Just like me and all of the other readers. Well, I mean, someone probably did, but most of the readers. And it's almost like Dory and Broggy are pointing and laughing at us before saying, they're asking why we're here. Obviously, it's because of the sun god. which also might speak to that disconnect that Dory and Broggy, and in fact all of the giants, have from the rest of the world. In all well-government-affiliated nations, the sun god has been stripped from history, and yet here Dory and Broggy are saying, you guys, didn't you learn about the sun god in giant school? Education these days. The sun god, that's obviously why we're here, and also probably why you're here, whether you realize it or not. I'm also wondering if this is why Dory and Broggy finally decided to end their feud, even if there was no official victor. Someone came to Little Garden and informed them that it was time for the sun god's return, which is a matter that takes priority over the honor of Elbaf. That or the giants knew all along. Like Odin and the Roger pirates, they knew exactly when Nika/Joy Boy was going to appear again. And one day on Little Garden, after another hard-fought tie, Dory and Broggy said, hey, look at the time, we've got to go. And then after encountering Shanks on Elbaf, he informed the giants that Luffy had the Fatesome Fruit, and when they saw the news of Luffy's siege at Egghead, that's why they set sail. Although you'd have to believe that they would have gone to help Luffy even if they didn't know about Nika. But whatever it turns out to be, I am so thrilled with the convergence of threads happening here. Because up until recently, I wasn't sure if we would ever see Dory and Broggy away from Little Garden. It was a huge shock just to see them on Elbaf. At one point, I thought that all of One Piece was going to be a footnote in their century-long feud. And of course the question I have now is, how many other giants have come to Egghead? We don't get a great look at it, but I believe the ship we see is the vessel of the original giant warrior pirates, as opposed to the new giant warrior pirates led by Harudin. It is a bit tricky to tell because the Jolly Rogers of both crews are mostly identical. One might even use the word plagiarism, but the new giant warrior pirates are just a modern rebrand. But when we did see a full shot of Harudin's ship, it appears to have a completely different front sail with what looks like a dragon on it. I also don't think the new giant warrior pirates were on Elbaf when we saw Shanks visit, so they're probably off elsewhere doing their own thing, and this is an OG giant warrior pirates mission. And what I love about that is that even though the giant warrior pirates disbanded a century ago, the Marines of today still recognize their Jolly Roger. They were so powerful and influential that they made this echo of fear throughout time, an echo that still resonates with people today. And two other giants we can probably expect to see are Oimo and Kashi. They were members of the original crew, and we did see them on Elbaf with Shanks. And it's pretty appropriate because the last time the Straw Hats interacted with them was also during a Buster Call. I don't know if this is what I should be excited for most, but I am really hyped to see Usopp's reaction to the giants, especially since he's the one who bonded with them more than any other Straw Hat. I might be hoping for a bit too much because Elbaf has really put Usopp in the backseat, even more so than usual, but whether it's now or later, I think this is the start of a really good time for him. This also gives us the potential solution for how Punk Records get saved. I said previously that it would take a giant like Oars to carry the big old brain, and no, we didn't get that, but an entire crew of giants with a massive transport device is a pretty good second option. And I don't know if this is too much fictional pirate cope on my part, but are we actually looking at a situation where a Buster Call may be defeated for the first time? Earlier on in the chapter, you see the Pacifista casually destroying 5 to 6 battleships in an instant. Each single Pacifista has the power to destroy a ship. So you've got 100 ships versus 50 Pacifista. And even if you somehow get things down to a 1-to-1 ratio, that is half of the Marine fleet wiped out. And that's without even considering the giants up your butt. So I'm not even sure anymore. One chapter ago, I was close to 100% certain that Egghead was going to have a horrible ending where we'd all have to flee for our lives. But it may very well be the world government that has to retreat here. And what I think this is going to come down to is Saturn. He's the only real X factor that the Marines have going for them right now, and he still has yet to reveal the full extent of his power. But even then, he's gonna need something pretty serious to back this up. But if there's anyone I trust to ruin our fictional pirate fun, it's Saturn. He's not gonna stand there and just let all of this happen, although that's what he's been doing so far. Regardless, I'm going to continue preparing for the worst, because I think we might finally be at Saint Saturn's breakpoint, where he needs to reveal exactly how the world government has maintained such an iron grip on power for the last millennia. The appearance of Dory and Broggy seems to me more for another reason than their sole intention or coincidence. I think it was rather Shanks' plan for them to go to Egghead Island for Luffy, and most likely, it was Shanks himself who went for them to notify them of Nika's return. In fact, I think it's part of the plan that Shanks has been planning for years, and is just starting to be put into motion since the awakening of the Nika fruit. So this gets into the mastermind Shanks theory. The idea that for better or worse, Shanks is subtly influencing the events of the world in a big way. But something that I'm still really curious about is what Shanks said in chapter 1076. I think I spent a bit too much time talking, but you can't blame us for wanting to catch up when old friends who thought each other dead are reunited. And I guess we don't confirm exactly who the old friends in question are, but it's heavily implied to be Dory and Broggy. So Shanks thought that they were dead and they thought that Shanks was dead, maybe. And if this is the case, then I highly doubt that they were part of his master plan, because there's no doubt in my mind that they went on to swap stories about Luffy, and Shanks definitely knows more than he's ever let on. He understood from the very beginning how important Luffy's devil fruit was to the world, hence why he made a one-arm investment in Luffy's future. I think this might be another classic case of One Piece fate. Shanks was checking in on Elbaf and just happened to run into Dory and Broggy. They swapped Sun God stories, and a bird delivered a newspaper detailing the siege of Egghead, and Dory and Broggy went, right, I guess we should go and help our dude. But if it was a coincidence, then that just raises the question of what Shanks was doing on Elbaf to begin with, whether it was just a quick stop for old time's sake, or if there was a greater reasoning. For example, Shanks has said that he's now planning to go after the One Piece, so maybe he was using Elbaf as a rally point for his grand fleet, to consolidate all of his forces in preparation to finally make the big move he's been planning. I just realized, this continues the trend of bringing back old characters for the ending, right? Like Crocodile on Cross Guild, Vivian Warpole in the Reverie, and now Dory and Broggy. So this comment has made me realize that recent One Piece has been very nostalgia heavy, but like for the Alabasta saga in particular, because now we do have returning to major plot relevance Princess Nefertari Vivi, Dory and Broggy from Little Garden, Warpole from Drum Island, and of course Crocodile from Alabasta. I mean, that last one's a bit of a stretch, because Crocodile has been pretty relevant again since Impel Down, but not at the major level he is now with his new bounty and affiliation with Cross Guild. But it's almost like Oda is going through the story and collecting all of the characters we need for the final saga, and he's doing it in a very orderly chronological manner as well. And if we keep doing it in this order, then our next stop would be to collect some Skypiea characters, then some Water 7 characters, and so on and so forth until we have all of our toys ready for a big colossal war. So we're getting into some very, very serious deep end One Piece now, where it's less about exploring and expanding, and now it's more about consolidating the characters and the stories that we already have. Katarina Devon will turn into Bonnie to take the pacifistas to Blackbeard, but real Bonnie will get to take Esper. So usually I'm not a huge fan of Devon theories, but this idea is actually kind of interesting. It makes me ask the question of how the pacifista recognize Bonnie. Is it just by voice pattern, or is there something deeper and more verifiable? Because if not, then any number of people could stroll in and take command of the army, and by any number I mean that number is probably more like 2, Katarina Devon and Bon Clay. Maybe some others as well, like Charlotte Brûlé. She can make weird mirror clones of people, but I don't think they speak. However, it does present a very convenient opportunity for the Blackbeard pirates to continue gathering power. If Katarina Devon was aboard the ship off the coast of Egghead, and I think it's highly likely that she was, just via the process of elimination, then we could have a scene where the pacifista suddenly stop shooting and all head in a certain direction, only for us to see what looks like Jewelry Bonnie aboard a Blackbeard pirate's vessel, greedily stockpiling bear dads for nefarious future use. I think for something like that to work, we might need to make the real Bonnie fall unconscious somehow, which isn't particularly difficult to do. The last time it happened was because she saw a bug. Why didn't York tell the elders about this ploy Vegapunk had up his sleeve? This is a big hole in the plot. So this is something that I was slightly confused about as well. The first time I read the chapter, I blitzed through it. That's what I do. I'm a One Piece addict, and when I get that fix, there is no mercy. But that's why I go through and reread everything several times at a much more socially acceptable pace. So when I did the first read through, I didn't quite register that Atlas knew about Bonnie's command power as well. I thought it might have been one of those strategic Oda dialogue constructions where he deliberately omits important stated information for the sake of a dramatic payoff. And this is definitely something that's going to be worth double checking with the official translation, because the scans have been a little bit off lately and not doing particularly well with the subtleties of language. But from what I see, Atlas knew about Bonnie's position, which implies that the rest of the satellites would know as well. And one of the rest of the satellites is York. And if she knew, then that's the sort of thing she either would or should have communicated during her betrayal. Maybe it slipped her mind because most of the communication occurred before Bonnie arrived on the island, so it just didn't seem all that relevant. But when York was caught and speaking to the elders via snail phone, then that might have been the time to say something. The other explanation is that Stella may not have told the satellites about Bonnie's special program because he needed to keep it as secret as possible. And even though the satellites are literally him, the more hims there are and the more hims that know opens oneself up to compromise. And then after York was discovered and everything went into hell, that's when Stella revealed revealed it to the others. My more pertinent question is, why didn't Stella reveal this earlier? Like, say when Bonnie was about to be killed by Saint Saturn and Stella was just there chilling going, oh no, there's nothing we can possibly do about this evil act. If only I had some sort of backup plan that I'd implemented to get us out of a situation just like this one. Because you can definitely justify it to an extent. If Stella tells Bonnie about her power, then she becomes a big target for Saturn. So even once Saturn does take command of the Pacifista, that's not necessarily an instantaneous tell Bonnie situation. But when she's about to die anyway, then that probably is a tell Bonnie situation. So I do like that Bonnie is at the top of the hierarchy. I think it makes nice, solid, dramatic, good feeling sense. But I also think that the idea was implemented a bit clunkily, and it was done so it could be used for this dramatic situation. Speaking of York though, I have another question. Who's watching her right now? We haven't seen her since chapter 1092, which is when the Vegapunks cracked her code, moments before Kizaru rudely intruded and had to be thrown out by a giant Luffy. But since then, we've accounted for all of the Straw Hats and all of the satellites minus York. So what's she up to? There's a couple of other missing entities as well, notably Stussy and Kaku, but Stussy was taken out of action by Rob Lucci, and Kaku is trapped within a bubble. And this is really bad, because leaving York unattended gives her the opportunity to escape and maybe head down and collect some Seraphim, which she can then command to do all sorts of assorted bad things. Are we 100% sure the Iron Giant is a robot? Could there be a chance it has somebody from the Void Century powering/living/installed inside of it? No, I'm not 100% sure at all. In fact, right now, I see both the Iron Giant and Kuma as very similar beings. Hollowed out shells with a little special something still lingering inside them, but with enough functional programming that each of them can still respond to certain commands or stimuli. So I suppose we have to assume that there's no biomatter within the Iron Giant, because surely Vegapunks would have performed a pretty extensive analysis on it, being Void Century technology and all, and Shaka did use the Iron Giant as the blueprint to build the Vegaforce 1, with the only thing he couldn't replicate being the power system. But the Iron Giant may very well be a Void Century Kuma, except instead of a Buccaneer, it was something else, like an Iron Giant that underwent the process for whatever reason. It's definitely not out of the question, because Void Century technology is still so far beyond what even Vegapunks can create. And weirdly enough, it was Luffy who determined that this robot could move on its own, because he was looking for a place to slot himself in and pilot the mech. But then Luffy couldn't find a spot, and he used his brain to come to the conclusion that the robot must move on its own. That is very clever for Luffy, and we need to give him full credit for that, because it doesn't happen often. And something else that's really clever is the cover page of this chapter. I really like the idea of Robin dressing up a crocodile, but the idea I like a lot more is Robin dressing up the crocodile, which thankfully Takoyaki111 on Twitter brought to fruition, and it is a frankly glorious image. Kizaru getting his ass whooped is what I'm going to enthusiastically wait for the next 2 weeks. Alright, we have to ask this question. Is Kizaru even trying anymore? Kizaru in this chapter seemed about as useful as a squad of fodder marines. He gets ordered to kill someone, then he shoots a bunch of pew-pews, but they don't do any real damage, and then he just gets smacked out of the way by the main character. What he's doing right now is almost like weaponized incompetence. I mean, it might just be because Luffy is far too overwhelming at full food power, but this doesn't feel like the same relentless Kizaru that we've been seeing throughout One Piece to date. Maybe he is trying. Maybe I expect too much of him. I don't know, I just can't stop the feeling that Kizaru's heart isn't in this anymore. I just want to remind people, when Luffy was furious at Arlong and the tension was at its highest thus far, he stuck his feet in the ground, spun around, and got stuck and dizzy. So this comment is in response to a very vocal expression of general displeasement of how Luffy is currently handling himself. Laughing and goofing around whilst his friends are in very serious danger. There's an old man bleeding out on the floor and such. But I do think that people are very quick to forget how goofy Luffy has been all the way from chapter 1 until now, even in the most dire situations. This is not a new thing. But at the same time, to play Devil Fruit's advocate, in defense of everyone who aren't thrilled with Gear 5th and how wacky it's made all the fights, I do kind of get what they miss. Because in the past, when Luffy was up against a really tough opponent, you could see it on his face. He had this really powerful and inspirational determined glare to relentlessly punch his way out of any problem. And it was great for being able to empathize with Luffy, because Oda has this way of drawing him that almost makes his pain and struggle feel tangible as a reader. And Gear 5th thus far has more or less removed that aspect of his character, and I definitely think people are hyper aware of it due to the Gear 5th opponents we've had so far. Luffy has fought 3 three people with this form: Kaido, Kizaru, and Rob Lucci. Lucci in particular draws a direct contrast because Luffy's original fight with Lucci was one of the toughest slugfests of his life, which I don't think was topped until Katakuri. But that's why I think using Rob Lucci on Egghead Island was a stroke of brilliance, because you have that direct contrast between Luffy then and Luffy now. Luffy fighting unawakened and trapped versus Luffy fighting fully liberated. But the main reason why this doesn't bother me is because of the messaging being hope. The message here isn't register the danger, pain, and suffering and then initiate a well thought out and execute a plan to stop it. No, it's none of that. The message is very simple: hope. And do you know what the most hopeless thing would be to see in any situation? Seeing the Joy Boy not expressing joy. Seeing the Joy Boy get angry or sad or serious. All of those things would be terrible. If the Joy Boy isn't smiling, then the world has no hope. It's doomed. So that's why I think it's important that no matter what the situation, the Sun God is always there, providing a ray of laughter, joy, and most importantly, a promise that everything is going to be okay. Do you think Harudin thought Usopp was Nika? He was the first to call him a god and raised him to the sky like a son. You know, that's not a terrible question. The Giants clearly seem to be much more well-educated about Nika than the rest of the world. So for fun, let's just examine the Dressrosa situation from Harudin's perspective. When Harudin first came across Usopp, he was a powerless slave, having been turned into a toy by Sugar. And what Harudin witnessed was Usopp going on to liberate all of the toy slaves in the stupidest and goofiest way imaginable. And if you know anything about Nika or Joy Boy, it's these two things. One, he liberates people, and two, he does weird stuff. All sorts of wacky body contorting and finding solutions to problems that defy conventional logic. And Usopp fulfilled all of that criteria immaculately, albeit accidentally. So no wonder it was Harudin to be the first to recognize Usopp's achievements, raise him aloft into what little sunlight there was in the underground facility, and then proclaim him as their savior, leading to the god Usopp epithet. Although I should say it's not clear if it was Harudin who labeled him. It would be very interesting if it was, because the dialogue says, "I knew it. You are sent from the heavens. You are our savior. Show us the light. What must we do, mighty god Usopp?" Which I think would be incredibly appropriate to come from Harudin, given what we now know now. Said too many nows there. But in the manga, the dialogue source is very vague. In the manga, it looks like the speech bubbles could be coming from anyone in the crowd, and that's what the anime decides to go with, because in that episode, the dialogue comes from some random dude in the crowd, not Harudin. Although who knows if that's actually the intended case or not. That might just be a decision that the anime made, not quite knowing Harudin's importance. But I should say, there is this really fun clip on YouTube with the God Usopp anime scene set to the score of The Lion King. Specifically the song when Simba ascends Pride Rock right at the end. And as hilarious as it is, it fits bizarrely well. But all in all, I do think it's possible that Harudin may have mistook Usopp for Nika because he may have had a rough idea of when Nika was supposed to return, which is the year that Dressrosa took place, and all of Usopp's actions very much add up to the legend. Or if not Nika, Harudin saw sun god qualities within Usopp. I hope Brook plays music to the rhythm of the drums of liberation. Alright, that is the sort of thing I'm waiting for as well. I don't think it's just, a fun coincidence that the #1 crew acquisition target for Luffy has always been a musician, and Luffy's heartbeat. That's cool and all, but that's not really drums, plural. So with stuff like the Iron Giant reacting to Luffy's heartbeat and struggling to get up, it makes me wonder what would happen if Brook noticed this jaunty organ tune and decided to replicate it on a much louder scale. We could turn Brook into a full-on field musician, because music is a historically hugely important part of warfare that doesn't usually get explored in much depth, but it was very important for communication because battlefields, mate, they can get noisy, what with all of the yelling and the dying and everything. So you needed a clear rhythmic sound to pierce all of that to give signals and such. And maybe in that way, Brook could even function as something of a pilot for the Iron Giant, controlling its movements by altering the Song of Liberation. But it also gives me hope for a future when, wherever the final war is, all of Luffy's forces march and or sail into battle with musicians everywhere, all playing the drums of liberation, and doing it so loudly that the song can be heard all the way from the top of the Red Line at Marijois. But this could also explain why the Iron Giant woke up 200 years ago. When we first discovered that, it led to a lot of speculation that someone had awakened the Nika fruit, and it might not have been that at all. It could have been something much simpler, like somebody stumbling upon an ancient piece of sheet music and deciding to play it. Then it turns out it's the Song of Liberation, and we accidentally woke up the robot. Kind of like what Uta did for the music demon in film Red. Either way, I'm very keen to see where the beat takes us from here, and if you want to stay up to date, then don't forget to subscribe to this channel for consistent injections of One Piece culture administered directly into your YouTube feeds. This is catastrophic news. Currently, there are 2 people and 1 swamp on Egghead Island who are about to give Marshal D. Teach everything he needs to completely destabilize the world. History is not going to remember this aspect of the Egghead incident. Tomorrow, the newspapers are going to be filled with reports of evil Emperor Monkey D. Luffy, beloved scientist dead, and the potential defeat of a marine fleet, a marine admiral, and an elder star. But what nobody will ever know is that this was the key turning point for the rise of Blackbeard and the beginning of the Great Age of Darkness. Dramatic, I know. But Blackbeard now has a crew member who can impersonate one of the 5 Elder Stars. And soon, he's going to know the location of 2 ancient weapons. So after Egghead Island, things are going to get very bad very quickly. In contrast to that though, this chapter kicks off better than I ever could have hoped, because we not only have the return of Oimo and Kashi, but for the first time, we see the full crew of the giant warrior pirates. That's a lot of big boys. And it's hard to get a precise number on them at the moment, but I would say lots. Lots is a good estimation. I count at least 10 new giant designs in this chapter, one of which is very curious because if you zoom in on his arm, there's a suspiciously sun-shaped tattoo there. So I imagine that all of these giant gents know exactly which mythical god they're here to assist, even if that god has no idea himself. We'll get to that in a bit because Luffy and Bonnie have a fantastic moment in this chapter, but this moment with the giants is so incredibly satisfying. Giants in One Piece have always seemed a bit underpowered because we only ever seem to encounter them in groups of 1 or 2, which are very manageable. Everyone gangs up, we focus down one target, we defeat said target, and then we knock off for lunch early that day. But then when you start adding your 3rd giant, your 4th giant, or in this case, your 14 giants, that's when their numbers start to make your numbers meaningless. To put it this way, the number of giants on Egghead Island right now outnumbers the amount of Marine Vice Admirals. So I'm thrilled that we're finally getting to see why the giants are so feared and revered, even by the world government, because they slice through that fleet like Anakin Skywalker in a room full of children. We hear a damage report later that 30 ships have been sunk, and that's mathematically quite convenient because that's approximately 30% of all of the forces brought to Egghead. However, that's also in combination with the Pacifista attacks, so it's hard to know how much of that is the doing of the giants, or actually if any of it is the doing of the giants. Their destruction might not even be being taken into account here because it's happening on the other side of the island. But the giants are spotted by Usopp, Nami, Chopper, and Edison. And you know, something I've just realized is that Chopper has never met Dory or Brogy. So in this chapter, he's thrilled to see Oimo and Kashi. Yeah, those are the guys I know. But he has no idea who the captains are. It's one of those trippy thoughts that happens for me because Little Garden and Drum Island are so close together and so far in the past that my mind often just conflates them as being practically the same thing. Dory and Brogy and Chopper, they all happen around the same time. It's very similar to my constant thought that Usopp and Buggy have somehow never met, which is probably for the best because who knows what would happen if those 2 gods were ever to clash. My favorite part of this section was easily Usopp though. I love that he was the first one to see the giants. I love the manly tears, Usopp contributing an honorable great river of Elbaf. And as much as I think he's been a bit underutilized on Egghead Island and Wano, and not even present on Whole Cake Island, so very underutilized there, this could be his time to shine because his role models are here. He needs to do something to prove that he is worthy of setting foot on Elbaf. And out of necessity, we have one of these cute little recaps of Little Garden and a sort of any slobby. We get these every now and then, and we had a lot of them during the Reverie arc in particular, but it's because the target audience of Weekly Shonen Jump are Japanese teenagers. So if a 15-year-old picks up this magazine, the really crazy reality is that they weren't even born when Little Garden was being published. And the crazier reality is that they weren't even born when any slobby was being published. I love these little recaps though because I really like seeing Oda's simplified drawing style, and it makes me want a book that tells all of One Piece in a fairy tale way with these kind of drawings. We do have a brief status update of all of the other Straw Hats, although it doesn't tell us anything we don't already know. Lilith and Brook need to stop the Thousand Sunny or they're going to be vaporized. Although I do really love the gag of Brook saying that they won't be able to stop for tea, so he's just having tea en route. That is the power of Brook. Right now, he's making Lilith look like the reasonable one, and I'm also surprised that he hasn't asked to see her panties yet. Meanwhile, we have Jinbei doing what Jinbei does, which is excessive traveling. I've recently gone back and reread the Egghead Island arc, and mate, this has not been Jinbei's arc. He spends most of his time traveling and musing to himself, or whoever else will listen. And in this case, he's doing a bit of a about Zoro choosing now to pick a fight. And you know what? I have to say, I agree with Shark Dad. You've got Zoro and Rob Lucci fighting on their own as if they're the main characters, but the truth is that this fight has become the least interesting and most unnecessary with everything else going on. And I'm not really sure why Zoro's doing this. By which I mean, I'm not really sure why he's not doing this. And by this, I mean anything. Why is he not doing anything? There's no advanced Conqueror's Haki, there's no Enma sucking him dry, there's no Ashura, there's no third sword, and he doesn't even have his bandana on. So I'm I'm forced to conclude that Zoro isn't taking this fight battle very seriously, but that's counter to everything he's saying, which is that he's in a hurry. So either something has happened to Zoro as a result of his Enma incident, or he's just foolishly playing with his cat food. Either way, he needs to pull his pants up and get to work. Elsewhere, seeing Bonnie and Luffy speak together is like that classic set of theater masks. You've got two panels. On the left, we have Bonnie representing tragedy, and on the right, we have Luffy representing comedy. Because when you boil everything down in the classical view, every story is either a tragedy or a comedy. Or in the case of Leo Tolstoy, all great literature is about one of two stories. A man goes on a journey, or a stranger comes to town. And One Piece definitely fits quite cleanly into his theory. But I think that One Piece is one of the only manga series I've ever seen that can balance tragedy and comedy so perfectly. And this situation is a fantastic example. You've got the tragedy of old man dying on the floor, and then the comedy of wacky jester cracking jokes, and also potentially cracking the skulls of some old Spider-Men. But even Luffy seeing Vegapunk dying on the floor is somehow successfully played as a joke, because he does his now classic Gear 5th eye pop, which I'm coming around to. I don't mind when Luffy does it. Him doing the eye pop is weird and fun, but I still think it looks just a little bit off when he makes other people do it. And to the best of my recollection, this is the first time that Luffy has heard the name Nika, because Bonnie calls him Nika, but Luffy completely disregards this. He moves on pretty quickly to talking about Bonnie's punch, which is a pretty good summary of Luffy in general. A man born into greatness who couldn't care less and decided to earn that greatness by taking his own path instead. Luffy then unleashes a glorious new Dawn attack, which sends Saint Saturn blasting off again. Was it just me though, or did anyone else find this attack just a little bit underwhelming? Which I don't think is a fault of its own. It's a beautifully drawn series of panels, but I can't help but compare it to the Kuma punch, a far less damaging attack, but one that came equipped with so much more emotional weight and satisfaction. It was like seeing St. Charles get hit by Moscard and then later being hit by Sai and Leo. It was great to see, I enjoyed it, but nothing's gonna top that OG Charles punch. I have to say though, St. Saturn is starting to hit me as a bit underwhelming as well, because as per usual, he just stood there and took another attack. He did fire back at Luffy, but it didn't do much, if anything. He also just stood there whilst Luffy and Bonnie had their lovely chat. So I gotta say, at this rate, Egghead Island is going to be a pretty resounding victory for us. Because the world government have selected Saint Saturn as their goalie, but he's refusing to save any balls because he views them as filthy and below him. So we just keep scoring and scoring, and that's all I've got for this sports metaphor. And we'll pick up again with Saturn later, because the most interesting thing about him is where his soon-to-be Spider Corpse landed. But we do have a rather dire, serious situation happening with Vegapunk. Since the beginning of this arc, I'd say that his death flag was hanging about half-mast, but we are fully raising it now. The dude is in such bad condition that if he were to be moved, he will die. It's like if the Grim Reaper were a T-Rex. He can't see you if you're not moving, so you're only alive while staying still. Although I'm pretty sure that that's something that Jurassic Park just made up. Dinosaur people, let me know in the comments. I know there's a lot of you. You were all very vocal during the raid on Onigashima correcting my dinosaur facts, so I defer to you. It's pretty worrying though, because if there were any possible way to heal Vegapunk, you'd think that Vegapunk would know about it. We're on an island packed with technology hundreds of years beyond our capabilities, made by the world's greatest genius, and even he doesn't see a way out of this. So how does this end? Probably not well, unless Luffy pulls some magic out of his butt, which to be fair is both metaphorically and literally possible. I tell you what though, Sanji is pulling his weight big time in this chapter. Zoro may have decided to screw around and play with the cat, not put his bandana on, but Sanji is taking this fight very seriously, which you can see because he lights his cigarette in front of Kizaru. That's Sanji's equivalent of the bandana. The steps go as such: light cigarette, inhale deeply, exhale, then beat the ever-loving crap out of whichever person is standing in front of him. And having him block Kizaru's attack was absolutely magnificent. Not so much because of how cool Sanji looked, but because of the face he made Kizaru pull. This is undisputedly my favorite face that an admiral has ever made. It makes Kizaru look like he accidentally shit himself mid-fight and is wondering how long he can pretend before someone points out the smell. Even Luffy couldn't make Kizaru pull a face like that. But also Frankie is shocked that Sanji stopped Kizaru's laser. And I'm not entirely sure why. I don't think lasers were ever deemed as anything particularly special, as in something that couldn't be stopped with basic armament haki. And the obvious explanation would be that Sanji's genetic enhancements have made it so that his body is so tough that he can block lasers in his base form, completely haki nude. And you know what? That's that's not too far out of the question. When Sanji awakened on Onigashima, his body was capable of all sorts of weird crap, and this is supported by the fact that Sanji's eyebrow has changed position again. The swirly part on this side is usually in the center of the face, and when it switches, that indicates that the genetic modifications are in play. It's a very subtle transformation, it's not obvious, loud, and in your face like Gear 5th, and as a result, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of people who read this chapter and missed it. But look, I thought that Sanji's arc was pretty much wrapped up after his fight with Queen, but we are still continuing because he's quite possibly the most appropriate person to be fighting here. We're on an island full of genetic cyborg things crafted from the legacy of Mads, and Sanji is Vin Smoke Judge's contribution to that legacy. He's basically a hornier pacifista. And he's a lot like Luffy, disregarding the actual reasons for his power in favor of his own personal agenda, which is love. Sanji says love is what stopped Kizaru's light, and Kizaru has a fantastic sense of humor in response, suggesting that all of physics needs to be rewritten. Thanks for that, Sanji. But things are not looking amazing for Kizaru in this situation. Just tackling Luffy was enough for him, but going up against both Luffy and Sanji might be too much even for this Marine Admiral, which is why we really need Saturn to return to the fray to balance things out. But he had a very concerning encounter during his time on the bench. As suspected, the Blackbeard pirates were indeed on Egghead, and it was Katarina Devon and Van Alga. But Katarina Devon sees Saint Saturn and makes a facial expression that I never want to see anyone point in my general direction, because this liver panel makes Devon look almost Big Mom-esque, as if she spotted a particularly delicious meal that must be devoured immediately. And then she touches him, which is huge. In case you've forgotten, Katarina Devon has a mythical Zoan-type devil fruit, the Inuinu no Mi Model Kyubi no Kitsune, which allows her to transform into other people, much like Bon Clay's devil fruit, but probably much more better. And I guess this confirms that she actually does have to touch someone to take on their appearance. But this is such a huge win for the Blackbeard pirates, because they can now impersonate one of the 5 elders. And after accomplishing this touch, Katarina Devon claims that their mission is complete. And that's quite chilling, because if their entire purpose on Egghead was to access Saint Saturn, then that means that there is a very, very high level leak within the Marines and Orwell government. For security reasons, Saint Saturn's presence on this mission was kept secret until very recently. And the Blackbeard pirates showed up at Egghead anticipating this. They were here about half a day before the siege even began. So they must have some pretty serious insider information. At the very least though, Blackbeard no longer has to fear the Seraphim. If they get attacked by one, then Devon can simply transform and bam, she's at the top of the command hierarchy. And if anything, this now gives them the ability to commandeer the Seraphim and continue the trend of emperors using world government weapons against them. But everything happening here is all according to Blackbeard's plan. He needs the authority of an Elder Star to enact something, which is probably why he chose to give this fruit to Devon in the first place. Or he chose Devon specifically because he knew she had that devil fruit in Impel Down. It all goes to show that as goofy as he seems in battle, you cannot underestimate this man because he has a plan. As a tactician, he may be one of, if not the best in the world, having carefully crafted a crew of fruit users designed to min-max his way through to world domination. The scariest thing about Blackbeard is... I take that back. The scariest thing about Blackbeard is that he represents the unknown. He's a big void of mystery, sinister mystery. But the second scariest thing is that he's so damn efficient. He gets the most accomplished with the fewest resources. And as stated in this chapter, he's a very special boy due to his lineage, which Devon is surprised that Saint Saturn even knows about, and I suspect that he only found out very recently. If I had to guess, I'd say that's what Shanks visited the 5 elders to discuss, Blackbeard's family secrets. And that family secret isn't even the Will of D. Blackbeard has never kept that name a secret. Marshal D teaches even on his bounty poster, so whatever this lineage is, it goes well beyond the Will of D. And at the end of this chapter, Swamp Nakama finally returns, but alas, he is someone else's Nakama now, begging to join the Blackbeard pirates like he's teacher's equivalent of Bartolomeo, which I really hope he is because that would set up a pretty fun fight in the future. Let's say we're in the final arc and we've got Luffy and Blackbeard fighting over here, but then over here, somewhere else in a significantly smaller, less impressive arena, we've got Bartolomeo versus Caribou, the battle of the fanboys. This is a catastrophic development though, because as I always stress, Caribou knows too much. He has the locations of 2 ancient weapons, having overheard the discussion on both Wano and Fishman Island, both locations that I now fear for. Especially Wano Wano because it's so close and an easy next stop for Blackbeard, but especially Fishman Island because it has practically no defenses against him. And consider this, we still don't know who assisted Luffy with the food situation, and should that person have somehow been Katarina Devon, then she would have touched him as well. So maybe Madame Charlie was right about Luffy destroying Fishman Island, or at the very least, a person who looks suspiciously like Luffy. And if you want to be the first to know how this plays out, then don't forget to subscribe to this channel for consistent injections of One Piece culture administered directly into your YouTube feeds. I love how Caribou is a Teach fanboy, just like how Bartolomeo is a Luffy fanboy. Can't wait for them to have a simp-off for their emperors. And someone then suggested a future final clash of Bajrang Barrier versus a swamp vortex, so having both fictional characters mimicking their fictional role models. And really, Caribou's powers could mimic a black hole. He does have seemingly infinite space in his pocket swamp dimension. He fits the Blackbeard pirate so well, because he has one of those really versatile devil fruits. You could load Caribou's swamp dimension up with an army, then have Van Alga teleport him, and then you'll have an instant invasion force. I have to say though, I'm a bit disappointed in Swamp Nakama, but we all knew this was coming. Ever since Caribou stated that he needed to tell a certain someone about all of these ancient weapons, I have been bracing for betrayal, but that doesn't make it hurt any less. Are you going to cry in your bed now that Oda shattered your dream? You know what? Yes. Gonna go cry now. Van Alga casually warping into Egghead and drops one of the hardest lines of the series. I really hope that Viz has this line in their translation because I really don't know how much you can improve on just saying the world. But Van Alga did go all Dio on us in this chapter, which is too bad for him because Dio's voice actor actually plays Kuzan in One Piece, so the Blackbeard pirates already have a Dio. It was pretty absurdly chilling though. Van Alga has never been one of my personally highly rated Blackbeard pirates, but with those two words, he's pretty much shot right to the top for me. It's the first time that a character in One Piece has threatened world domination, and I've actually believed it. Even when Kaido was talking about starting a big world war to do all of the big bad things, I never took it seriously because in the back of my mind brain, I knew that he was going to be beaten during the Wano arc, so everything he said during the Wano arc was meaningless. But with the Blackbeard pirates, they have a lot of time left to do any number of shocking things, and I don't doubt that they could make it happen, especially since they have the patience, the competency, and most importantly, they even seem to have fate on their side. It's as if there's some sort of outer god placing bets on both sides here, helping both Luffy and Blackbeard content with whoever wins so long as it's one of them. It really could be a case of angels versus demons here, especially when you see that demonic glare of Katarina Devon. I really don't know how Oda does it, but he can conjure deeply disturbing imagery with a simple face in a tiny sliver of a single page. But I think that all of the Blackbeard pirates have that aura of generally unsettling. The only way I can really think to describe it would be in a sort of true crime way. They all have the vibes of a serial killer, which you don't get from antagonists like Crocodile, who exudes more of that mafia boss persona, or Kaido, who comes off as a more power-hungry war general. I mean, neither are particularly good, but at least there's something there, something human that you can latch onto. Whereas with the Blackbeard pirates, there's nothing. They're these disturbing anomalies that exist within the system, with their motivations and capabilities completely shrouded. I have to say though, I'm very surprised that Van Alga is here because I was personally betting on Lafitte. He and Katarina Devon were the only two crew members we hadn't already seen elsewhere in the arc. And Lafitte, I guess he may still be here. Someone needs to be aboard the ship, I guess. But Van Alga is quite curious. In this chapter, Alga also mentions that he hasn't mastered his devil fruit yet, which probably means that he can't do extreme stuff, since he couldn't even get all the way off Egghead Island, but it plants some pretty nefarious seeds for his future potential. At the same time though, he must have some sort of intermediate abilities because Van Alga, I think he set a record during this arc. Over the course of this arc, Van Alga has been active in 3 different locations around the world. First with the cover story where he and Kuzan invaded Whole Cake Island to capture Charlotte Pudding. Then he was also present on Winter Island fighting against the Heart Pirates, and now he rocks up to Egghead Island. And I think the fact that we're seeing him and only him in 3 different locations speaks pretty highly about the insane mobility he does have, which is a ridiculously ideal power for a sniper, because even if his opponent manages to close the gap between them, all Van Alga needs to do is warp away and get back into position. Ever since Van Alga was introduced, it's been more or less locked in fan headcanon that his final fight is going to be against Usopp. They're both snipers and they're both, well, that's all they have in common, but it would be really cool to see a sniper battle at some point. For this to work though, Usopp's gonna need to seriously step up his game, perhaps developing his observation haki to the point where he can predict where Alga is going to teleport and aim for there instead. Otherwise, I don't know how he or really any Straw Hat can deal with him. Other than Usopp, they're all quite close to mid-range fighters. But also, we do need to talk more about Lafitte, or the lack of Lafitte, a Blackbeard pirate who has been in 0 of the 4 locations his crew has been active in during this arc so far. So quite the underachiever compared to Van Alga. Again, I think it's plausible that he could be on the ship, but I would be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to share one of my favorite stupid theories that I've recently been made aware of, which is that Lafitte is the marine leaker, although you may know him by his other name, Hattori. That's right. All of Blackbeard's insider information comes courtesy of Hattori because he's always present in top secret discussions involving Rob Lucci. Because remember, when we saw Lafitte invade Impel Down with the Blackbeard pirates, he had wings. And pigeons also have wings, which makes him a pigeon-type Zoan fruit user, and Hattori is just his full beast form. That's how he got all the way up to Marijois without being noticed, just like Karasu did via being bird. Lafitte has been called a master of stealth, which is quite impressive considering that he chooses to wear tap shoes. Dude is really playing life on the hardest difficulty there is. As fun as it is though, it's hard to explain things like how Lafitte could have gone to Marijois, whilst also infiltrating Water 7 at the same time as Lucci's beloved pigeon, but he's not to be underestimated. As a master of hypnosis and stealth, it's very, very troubling when we don't see him, especially since the Blackbeard pirates have such a strong presence in this arc. It's like knowing that you've got a spider somewhere in your room, and there's a big difference when you can see the spider versus when you can't see it. When you can see it, you can monitor it and eventually do something about it. But when you can't see it, you just have to assume that it's lurking in the shadows and doing something sinister in order to plot your eventual downfall. Also, fun thing about Katarina Devon. After all of these insane theories about who she's been impersonating on Egghead, she's Bonnie, she's Luffy, could she be Vegapunk, could she be Kizaru? I love that after a year of all of that, when she eventually did show up, she was just herself. Just plain old Katarina. There was no grand reveal, it was just like, oh hey, Katarina Devon is also here. And I think that speaks pretty strongly to our tendency as a fan base to seriously overthink things. Now, something I didn't address in the chapter review video is the potential implication that Katarina Devon can not only now become Saint Saturn, but also gain access to his powers, which is what would theoretically separate her from Bon Clay. Bon Clay touches someone and then he becomes a printout cardboard copy of a body, but Katarina Devon, she downloads the full file. Bon Clay has used his ability to turn into Devil Fruit users in the past, notably Luffy, Chopper, and Magellan, but he's never been shown as capable of having their fruit powers as well, with the possible technical exception of Chopper because Bon Clay appeared in his brain point. But that might be because Chopper was already in that form when Bon Clay touched him, so that's the data he took. And maybe if Luffy was stretching his arm when he was touched, then Bon Clay would become a Luffy with a really long arm. But with Devon, I suspect that her fruit might be quite broken in this regard, and that she can mimic Devil Fruit users, abilities and all, which would only add to the growing list of broken Blackbeard fruits. I recently did a video on Doc Q's Devil Fruit, the disease maker, and in theory that can mimic any Devil Fruit by creating a new disease with the symptoms that are that Devil Fruit power. And obviously we have Blackbeard who just flat out uses multiple fruits, and if Katarina Devon can also mimic fruit powers, then we're not just dealing with 10 Titanic captains here. We're dealing with the most versatile group of ability users to have ever existed. There's also a fun new Van Alga idea, which is that he's the one who warped the food to Luffy, which is how the food appeared out of nowhere. We didn't need any stealthy swamps or lightspeed Uber Eats because Van Alga can blink things in and out from insane distances. And also, he could have been the one who warped Luffy to the replicator. No one would have noticed. And helping Luffy makes a lot of sense for them to take the opportunity to touch Saturn, or to take the opportunity to touch Luffy. You warp Luffy to the replicator, Katarina Devon rubs his belly like a lucky Buddha, and then you blink away. Although their original target could have been anyone. Perhaps even Kizaru, who was vulnerable on the floor at the time, or even Vegapunk. They could have been sent to Egghead Island to find a way to counter the Seraphim that Blackbeard himself recently encountered on Amazon Lily. And then, wow, what a fatesome coincidence. Why take an Admiral or a Vegapunk when an Elder Star happens to be here? That's convenient timing. I love how Sanji doesn't even understand his own powers and just does things. Come to think of it, it's the same for all of the monster trio. Luffy is the obvious one because he has no idea that he's an awakened fruit user. In fact, he has no idea what Devil Fruit he's even using. He just took all of those unknown factors and labeled it as Gear 5th because it needed a name. And then there's Zoro, who has no idea what he's doing, but doing it anyway. It took Kaido to point out that he was a Conqueror's Haki user, and Zoro was all like, lol, what's that? So I think it's pretty perfect that Sanji also fits into this trend. Although in Sanji's case, I think it might be more about denial. Because look, he's smart enough to know what's happening, but he can't accepts that, because that would mean accepting all of this that is his father's doing. Or maybe it's a mix of both. Sanji credits his abilities to love because whatever he is right now is also the result of his mother's sacrifice. It was her love that gave him these abilities in spite of his father's dickery. We gotta talk about boots though. A lot of people in the comments have been proposing that Sanji was able to block the laser because he was wearing the special Egghead boots. And my response to that is that boots are not gloves. Early on in the Egghead arc, we were introduced to the light pressure gloves, which gave Atlas the ability to physically interact with holograms on the island. And I think a lot of people have conflated these specific gloves with all Egghead Island attire. But these are a special item, and the boots don't do the same thing to the best of our knowledge. Also, Kizaru's shock may not necessarily have been as a result of the block itself, but the speed required to make the block. Because theoretically, Sanji is moving at whatever the equivalent of this light speed is, which even though it's not real light speed, is still pretty fast. And I do have to mention that one panel of Kizaru closing his eyes before firing on Vegapunk and Bonnie, and I have to mention it because, look, bruh, what a coward. I get that you've made your decision to be the cog in the machine. Oh, I have no self-agency, I can't control it, it's my job, gotta do it. I get that, but don't look away. I get that you, Marine Admiral, don't want to do this, but in that case, maybe use your light powers to build yourself a nice low-gear backbone, and then just don't do it instead. But right now, he's doing the worst of both worlds. These Kizaru stocks, they are plummeting. But related to this, we also have another market update. Sanji stocks up, Zoro stocks down. Yeah, from what I see, the market is not reacting well at all to Zoro with the news of chapter 1107. Zoro has dropped from an all-time high on Wano, where he injured Kaido and briefly blocked the strongest attack ever conjured in One Piece history, and from that peak, the market has fallen because he's currently being stalled by Rob Lucci. I really don't think we've seen this kind of drop in Zoro's shares since Whole Cake Island, where he took a 2-year break from trading. There was similar market movement back in 2021 when Sanji was captured by Black Maria, while Zoro was fighting against 2 emperors on the roof. At that moment, Sanji stocks dipped to their lowest in a decade, correlating with Zoro's all-time high. And of course, it would be irresponsible not to say that Robin stocks also saw a huge bump in this period as well. Look, this is not financial advice, but as exciting as this movement is, if I was heavily invested in Sanji stocks, I would use this opportunity to sell, because historically, Sanji highs do not last. They see a nice sharp spike and then they go plummeting back down. So this would be a good time to get out, make some belly, and then buy into Zoro shares while they're cheap. In all seriousness, I love that Sanji got this moment against Kizaru. Sometimes I do think that Oda deliberately stitches Sanji up because he's designed to be a funny character. He straddles the line between knight and jester. It reminds me a lot of one of my favorite One Piece meta interactions, because Sanji's voice actor Hiroaki Hirata has a very fun relationship with Oda where they jab back and forth at one another, and according to Hirata, after Whole Cake Island finished, Oda looked at him dead in the eyes and he said, "Sanji will never be that cool again." And then in an interview that Oda gave for the One Piece newspaper, he stated, "If Hirata-san wants me to draw cool Sanji, then Hirata-san himself needs to change." So sometimes I do think that Oda deliberately turned Sanji into a joke for the sake of their public in-joke. Marine Giant Warrior Squad is such a joke compared to the Giant Warrior Pirates led by Dory and Broggy. Mate. When all of these forces gathered at Marineford, I remember seeing that line of giants and going, whoa, they're gonna be trouble. But they weren't, and they never will be. After seeing the Giant Warrior Pirates in action, there's something that the Giant Squad is severely lacking, and that something is probably more like several things. They lack that Elbathian battle lust and savagery. The Giant Squad are almost like domesticated giants, which makes sense because they're very likely giants who were sold to the world government by Mother Carmel, although the only giant we have confirmation on with that happening is Vice Admiral John Giant. There's this really chilling part of Big Mom's flashback where Mother Carmel states that she's been selling children for 50 years, half a century of child trafficking, and not just small children as well, but big children. But I guess this is the difference between hand-reared giants in a marine zoo and giants who grew up in the wild under the principles of Elbaf. And on Egghead, it feels like we're seeing what a true force of giants can do for the first time, and it's definitely reinforcing why we do not mess with them. Also, with the Marines, we got another name for one of the Egghead Vice Admirals. I kind of ignored it in the chapter review video because I was focused on other things, and also I didn't get the reference. But his name is Red King, and quite a few of you have pointed out to me that this is a reference to Ultraman, and after having googled Red King, I 100% see the resemblance, and I love that Oda's solution to mimicking the kaiju texture was to give Red King 6 chins. Blackbeard being Joy Boy's descendant is the only way the term special lineage makes sense. That could be an interesting idea, because that would turn our final conflict into a battle between the biological descendant of Joy Boy and the inheritor of Joy Boy's will. However, at the moment, the simplest answer is probably still Rocksteady Zebek. If Shanks were to find out about that connection, then that would certainly warrant a visit to Snitch to the Elder Stars, as he was the man who was previously closest to bringing the world government to ruin, which could show an interesting dichotomy happening within the D clan. To illustrate, during Fishman Island, we had a strong juxtaposition between ideals. We had Queen Otahime on one side and Fisher Tiger on the other, two people who more or less wanted the same outcome but believed in different methods of getting there. And that could be what's happening with these two D factions. You've got this force of laughter, happiness, and hope above all, represented by Joy Boy and Luffy, and alongside that an opposing ideal of darkness, represented by Rox and Teach. Both aiming for the same thing, which is to get rid of the world government and liberate the world, but through different methods. The Joy Boy and the Sad Boy, who pretends to be happy, but we've all seen that picture of him crying as a child, so you cannot fool me, Sad Boy. And if all of you want to see how this plays out, then don't forget to subscribe to this channel for consistent injections of One Piece culture administered directly into your YouTube feed. Saint Saturn has revealed his final form, the 9 Vice Admirals are on the attack, Kizaru is in some big trouble, and Dr. Vegapunk is about to reveal the truth of the world. We are at a turning point in One Piece history. A week or 2 or 3 from now, we won't be able to look at this series the same way again. And it's all because of what's about to happen on Egghead. There are so many surprises to come. But the first surprising thing in this chapter is that Van Alga has actually heard of Caribou. I mean, he does have a 210 million berry bounty, which did make him one of the next generation of super rookies on Sabadi, but I still like that the Blackbeard pirates seem to be very aware of the world around them. The second surprising thing is how cautious Van Alga is being, just because that's not the typical Blackbeard pirates MO. They're more the kind of people to let fate guide them, and meeting Caribou here is quite the fatesome event, but logically it does make a lot of sense. This is a world government controlled island, and it would be very convenient for a pirate to randomly pop up here wanting to join their crew. What are the odds? It's cliche to say this, but it's convenient, too convenient. So I imagine that Van Alga suspects that Caribou is some sort of double agent. Like how Rocinante infiltrated Doflamingo's crew, or how Diaz Drake quote defected and started his own crew. For all Van Alga knows, Caribou could be a Cypherpole agent, masterfully swamping his way into an Emperor's inner circle. And really the only reason why we know that's not true is because we get an inner monologue from Caribou, which narratively functions as one of those recap points. He goes over all of the information he's gathered over the last 12 years, I think, during which time he makes my favorite Caribou expression, which is the one where he's so sinisterly pleased with himself that he rubs his, what even are the things that he has? They're not hands. Hands would be like this, so he must be doing this. Are they hands? I want to say they're hands, but have we ever seen his hands? I was so curious about this question that I had to go away and research, and it turns out that yes, we did see his hands in the cover story, where he's given a meat pie by that lovely old lady. But it looks like Caribou is on his way to Hachinosu, and given how much the Blackbeard pirates must distrust him, I wouldn't be surprised if Katarina Devon and Van Alga stuffed him into a locked barrel as well, just like the Straw Hats do. This chapter is so much bigger than a swamp in a barrel, because after ever so much waiting and anticipation, the Vice Admirals are finally kicking into action, and then promptly being smashed into the floor like Tosa. He made such a big show of his 10-fingered Shigun sort of technique before being swatted into oblivion by Broggy. It's a bit of a disappointing showing for the Vice Admirals. For a rank that is so powerful, they so rarely get to show that off. These guys are one step away from an admiral. They're genuinely dangerous, but you'd never know that just from reading the story. Something I want to point out is that while Tosa's technique is similar to the Shigun variants from the Rokushiki set, it is still distinctly different. This attack may remind you of the 10-finger pistol that was tanked by the unfortunately fragile body of Sogeking, but Tosa's variant covered his hands in armament haki as well. And his hands were also slightly further apart. Jabra's, they were closed together like that, whereas Tosa's are like the jaws of a wolf about to chomp down on a delicious 12-year-old girl. What a proud moment this must be for him. But I breathed a huge sigh of relief when Dory and Broggy came into contact with Frankie's group, and when I say huge sigh, I mean a sigh that I've been holding on to for almost 19 years, because this is it. Dory and Broggy have finally reunited with the Straw Hats. I mean, just one Straw Hat, Frankie, but this surreal moment is like, it's like being repeatedly struck in the nuts with a nostalgia stick, and it's so perfect that they encountered only Frankie first. Dory and Broggy state that they made sure to check all of the bounty posters so that they they could keep up with all the new members of the Straw Hat Pirates, which was confusing for a fraction of a second, because if they did that, then how would they not know Frankie? Well, they don't know Frankie because his bounty poster currently shows the Thousand Sunny. And before that one, it showed the Frankie Shogun, and before that one, it was Frankie's pre-time skip form that he looks nothing like anymore. Nobody who hasn't met Frankie actually knows what he looks like. So in a weird way, this giant, loud, speedo-wearing robot might actually be the best option for stealth missions going forward. He's the only one who is somehow not recognizable as a Straw Hat. The most adorable panel of the chapter for me was definitely the one of Dory smiling at Bonnie, because both Dory and Broggy are really good with children. And this whole situation reminded me of 102 years ago when a little girl named Yuki asked which beast was bigger and accidentally started Dory and Broggy's century-long duel. I've always wondered what happened to Yuki. If she was still alive today, she'd be well over 100 years old. But that's not unprecedented in One Piece. And Oda has said that humans in the One Piece world live longer than in reality, because he doesn't like the idea of them dying. So Yuki might still be out there somewhere. Dory's smile is really something else though. And I love that in every panel featuring the giant warrior pirates, they're all smiling, having a great time even in this pretty desperate situation. It's almost as if part of Elbathian culture is to really embody the spirit of the sun god, to make sure to always laugh and give hope in any scenario, but not false laughter. They're not faking it. It's just that much like Luffy and Gear 5th, they are all genuinely having the time of their lives, and I don't think that's a coincidence. Frankie also mentions that he's heard of these giants before, and whilst he doesn't outright say this, the way I'd put it is that Frankie's heard of them because Usopp never shuts up about them. In fact, Oda did reveal that the only reason why the later Straw Hats know about the early crew adventures is because Usopp is always telling their stories again and again and again aboard the Thousand Sunny. Back to Vice Admirals though, each of the 9 have been ordered to the island to hunt down and kill Jewelry Bonnie. So 9 Vice Admirals versus one 12-year-old girl. But the theory is that killing her will allow them to take command back of the Pacifista. And I'm not sure how solid of a theory that is. If anything, killing her might accidentally lock these commands in indefinitely. But this order is given by Vice Admiral Doberman, a figure who I really appreciate because he was one of the 5 Vice Admirals who conducted the Buster Call on Enies Lobby. So it's really nice to have him here for contrast. Previously, when we encountered him, the Buster Call was this overwhelming, apocalyptic, unstoppable force. But now, the second time that he's here, I can't help but feel like we're on the verge of actually beating the Buster Call. It doesn't feel particularly threatening. I know the priority is still to escape and everything, but I just don't feel that same sense of danger. And if anything, I think that Doberman feels the sense of danger that I was feeling back at Enies Lobby. The 2 Vice Admirals to keep an eye on, however, are of course Bluegrass and Doll. I love Bluegrass because she has such a quirky devil fruit, the Nori Nori no Mi, which allows her to control anything she rides. But then, something I did not expect. Vice Admiral Doll said that she used to be under the command of a giant, who Bluegrass deduces was Jaguar D. Sol. And I think that this is the second mention of Sol in this chapter. Prior to that, Dory and Broggy alluded to some sort of scholar who mentioned Vegapunk. And that scholar is potentially Sol because no, he wasn't a scholar at first, but he sure did go on to read a hell of a lot of books from that Ohara tree, although the scholar terminology was quite unique to the inhabitants of Ohara. So maybe it wasn't just Sol who survived, and there is another Oharan scholar waiting to reunite with Robin on Elbaf. Perhaps some sort of Robin mother or some sort of Professor Clover. We never saw either of them die, so anything's possible. We're getting to the point where it's even possible for Saint Saturn to start taking this situation seriously, because this old man has a brand new transformation and it's pretty wild. He doesn't look all that different at first glance, but now he's lost all of his human bits and he's more or less a full-on giant spider, like an Elden Ring boss. If I had to guess, I'd say that this was Saturn's full beast mode. We still don't know if he's a Devil Fruit user, but this is very consistent with their typical transformations. And Sanji has a line here that I love. In fact, I think it's the line of the chapter. He says something like Saturn has given up even pretending that he's a human, which is such a perfect thing to say that encompasses Saturn and in fact the roles of every Elder Star. They sit at the tippy top of Marijois, governing all humanity, pretending to be human themselves and acting in the best interest of humans, but even if they are biologically human, they are mentally so dissociated with the entire race that they may as well be demons. The really curious thing about Saturn in this form is that he has no dialogue. And not only that, he doesn't even have any reaction shots. It's weird because previously Saturn was more than happy to talk or at least give like a bubble with an exclamation mark if something surprising were to happen. But in this form, he has none of that. And I think this might be a conscious choice by Oda to further remove Saturn from humanity by stripping away his ability and or desire to communicate with us in any way, shape or form. And all we really have is that close-up of his eye, which looks simultaneously fearsome yet empty. It really is like you've cornered a wild beast and they're just acting on instinct to attack. And it's all about the eye. This eye makes that wide open pupil heavily dilated, taking in as much light and as much information as possible, whereas Saturn's pupils before were quite small and dismissive, as if he had no care for anything around him. He didn't even want to see it. It was all just so simply beneath his concern. And it was the Volume 1 podcast on Twitter that brought my attention to this, but Saturn's eyes are also very reminiscent of Francisco Goya's painting titled Saturn Devouring His Son, one of the more hauntingly recognizable pieces of art history. So one really cool interpretation of this painting is that it's portraying the idea of conflict between elderly and the youth, the idea that the elderly can sacrifice the young to prolong their own lives and positions, which pretty perfectly ties into the 5 elder stars. But it's also been recognized by art critics and historians as a quintessential depiction of madness, eyes that are completely devoid of calculated reasoning and operating on instinct alone. And just one more thing about the eyes. I promise that after this I'll shut up about the eyes, but it's going to be worth it. Saturn's eyes aren't all too dissimilar from what we see of Luffy at the end of the chapter. We'll talk about this moment in much more detail, of course, but Oda juxtaposes the eyes of Saint Saturn and Monkey D. Luffy on this page, and they are shockingly similar. Eyes that are wide open with incredibly chunky black void pupils, which make it look like a predator Saturn has just fallen into the trap of an even larger predator Luffy. There's always a bigger fish, even if you're a spider. And the fact that Luffy is saying that there is no way he's letting them escape is such a terrifying use of language. This is something we definitely need to wait for the official translation to check, but with this statement, Luffy has flipped everything, because he's the one who's supposed to be doing the escaping. But that statement combined with these eyes is giving me even more demonic vibes than Saturn was capable of, and it's showing us that this sun god does have a vengeful side to him. The last pages of this chapter were superb in general though. I mean, this panel of Luffy simultaneously holding off Saturn and grabbing Kizaru is the sort of thing that deserves to be preserved and painted as a giant mural somewhere. The scale of it is just so epic. And speaking of giants, this is rapidly becoming a giant-only conflict. Saturn transformed into a giant, then Luffy transformed into a giant, and shortly, the giant story and Broggy are going to arrive at this very spot. So that's a lot of big boys. But one reason why I appreciate this art so much is because it does finally show us that Gear 5th isn't always going to be a wacky cartoon. Luffy is still capable of being serious in this form and making all of the cool, determined facial expressions from his previous fights. I just think it takes a lot more to push him into this state than it did previously, because Luffy used to run into walls a lot easier than he did now. When he was up against Rob Lucci at any slobby, Luffy was still a rookie pirate who couldn't even use Haki. He had to fight with raw willpower alone, and not the Haki willpower, like the willpower that doesn't manifest. But these days, Luffy has grown so much that it takes an incredibly serious effort to push him to his limits. So it's not that Gear 5th is never going to have these raw, serious, and cool moments. It's that we're at the stage where you need to throw something truly worthy at our captain in order to get him there. And seeing Kizaru grabbed again is just, it's amazing. And it makes me wonder if Luffy was taking it easy on him the first time. Because this Kizaru, mate, he looks like he's struggling. It's the first time I think we've seen a Marine Admiral look so powerless. Or at least the first time since we last saw Kizaru looking so powerless on the floor. Meanwhile, Saint Saturn just looks like an overly excited dog trying to be wrangled by its owner. So I do hope that this panel simmers down the Gear 5th slander, because I don't know if it's just me, but this power-up keeps giving me everything I want and more. Never in my wildest dreams could I have imagined Luffy in situations like this. Now, for a quick market update, last week we had some big movement on Sanji stocks, and I believe the advice I gave at the time was, look, this is not financial advice, but as exciting as this movement is, if I was heavily invested in Sanji stocks, I would use this opportunity to sell, because historically, Sanji highs do not last. They see a nice sharp spike and then they go plummeting back down. And it looks like that market prediction has come to fruition, as Sanji has quickly been relegated to rescue boy and had the kick crapped out of him by Kizaru. I meant to say crap kicked out of him, but I'm not re-recording it. And I'd like to congratulate everyone who sold their Sanji stocks last week, because you're now set for retirement. But the real tragedy here is, of course, Dr. Vegapunk. As if this poor man hadn't suffered enough being impaled by Saint Saturn, in this chapter he got thoroughly donutted once more by the light sword of Kizaru, which has me conflicted. Because I was a big supporter of the Kizaru redemption idea, I still think it makes sense, because Kizaru was always resolved to kill Vegapunk, but actually seeing it happen, I don't know, it may very well have locked Kizaru out of that ending. It's hard to see redemption from here, because it's a pretty brutal panel. Oda was not kind with the artwork at all, making sure to portray Vegapunk experiencing as much physical pain as Oda's pen could muster. And now we have to ask the very real question of, is Vegapunk dead? Sanji does pick him up, and actually that's the first concerning thing. Previously, Vegapunk said that he'll die if he moves, which is why Frankie's group didn't take him. However, Vegapunk may have just been lying and wanted them to escape without his sack of genius meat slowing them down. But it is funny that Sanji goes ahead and picks him up after all of the trouble Vegapunk went to not to be picked up. But then Sanji says something very concerning at the end. He's not quite sure if Vegapunk is still alive, and he sees Vegapunk smiling. As much as I love the smiles on all of the giants earlier in the chapter, smiles can also be a not so great sign, because it's a very classic way for beloved One Piece characters to die, with a smile on their faces, satisfied with their actions, as well as their legacy, and knowing what's in store for the future. Even without the will of D, those adjacent to it still seem to die with that trademark smile. But the thing that makes me fear most for Vegapunk is what happens next. Out of nowhere, a broadcast begins where Vegapunk on a screen promises to tell everyone the truth of the world. And I fear for his life because it looks like a last will and testament, a video programmed with a dead man switch to go live in the event of, well, unfortunate death-related circumstances, which would be giving Vegapunk his Whitebeard moment. At the very end of his life, Whitebeard got to declare to the entire world that the One Piece existed, and that small piece of information was enough to reinvigorate the entire age of piracy. So maybe we've been looking at the Egghead incident the wrong way. Up until this point, we, or at least I, have been assuming that the big revelation to rock the world would be the defeat of an Elder Star and/or an Admiral, and/or a Busticle, and/or the death of Vegapunk. So many and/ors. But what if the scenario that no one saw coming is this message? The world is shaken by a truth bomb detonated by Dr. Vegapunk. And the really wild thing is, I have no idea what he's about to say. There is so much that's been hidden in the One Piece world that we as readers know about, and at the same time, so much that we as readers don't know about. Which means that the next chapter could contain one of the biggest lore bombshells we've ever had. We could hear any number of things. All sorts of secrets from the Void Century, perhaps the name of the ancient kingdom, or even something completely out of left field that nobody could have predicted. All I know is if you want to be the first to know, then make sure to subscribe to this channel for consistent injections of One Piece culture administered directly into your YouTube feed. Angry Gear 5 is genuinely scary. Luffy is basically the living embodiment of freedom, has just told Saturn, "You're not getting away." That actually makes these last few panels that much more alarming. The idea that our god of fun, happiness, and freedom has made a divine decision to rescind the freedom of some in order to ensure the freedom of others. It's like a reversal of what the world government does. They subject the world for the freedoms of the few, whereas Luffy is subjecting the few for the freedom of the world. And I honestly still can't get over the ending of this chapter, with Luffy holding off both a Marine Admiral and an Elder Star, because this is probably the first time that Luffy has truly shown himself to be an Emperor of the Sea in all of the traditional ways that one would expect. Even when he was fighting against Kaido, I don't think we ever quite hit that feeling. But this Luffy is feeling a lot like Whitebeard rampaging through Marineford, taking on high-level opponents simultaneously. This is an emperor. In fact, no, it's not. It's much more better. This is a pirate king. Maybe even more, because this is a sort of feat that we've never even heard of Roger accomplishing. He probably didn't face off against an Elder Star, so we might be in the realm where Luffy is now overtaking Roger and solidifying his own path rather than following in the footsteps of another for the first time. The most terrifying thing I noticed about Saturn in this chapter is that he never seems to be looking at the characters, at Luffy or Sanji as he barrages them with his leg attacks. He's looking at you, the reader. I think you might be right. Whenever I make videos with my thumbnail artists, we go through a lot of back and forth about pupil placement. It's amazing how just moving them slightly in any way completely changes the intention of the image. And with Saint Saturn, his pupils are dead center, which is spiking the camera. And whether it was Oda's intention or not, it looks like he's looking beyond the page and at the readers, nay, looking into the readers. Having pupils right smack bang in the center also indicates the opposite, though, a complete lack of focus on anything. To me, Saturn is acting like a mindless beast, and I wonder if that's ammunition to add to the idea that he and the other 5 Elder Stars are the sinister satellites of Imu, these twisted demonic puppets conjured due to whatever ability Imu has, and Saturn is now in full-on autopilot, initiating all of his assorted inbuilt demon protocols, sort of like programming Bartholomew Kuma. I mean, I'm sure that Saint Saturn must have gotten that wonderful idea from somewhere. I'm also sure that this is doing absolutely nothing for people who have a fear of spiders, because this one, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and its eyes keep exuding more and more killer instinct. All I can say is, welcome to Australia. I can see why Luffy being exposed to poison so much in the series might come into play here. That's definitely something worth pointing out. Sanji says that Saturn is now completely covered in venom. So in that final panel, Luffy, by grabbing his head, is coming into contact with yet another bout of poisoning. Not that it means much at this stage. Between Crocodile, Magellan, Magellan and licking all sorts of strange fish on the way to Whole Cake Island, Luffy has been exposed to every possible substance capable of taking him out. When examining him on Fishman Island after being poisoned for the 56th time, Chopper noted that Luffy's body is now trained to naturally fight off whatever it encounters. So no threat of venom is going to be able to break Luffy's Gear 5th happy time. He's done this a million times before. In fact, at this point it's expected. The game wouldn't be any fun without the venom. Kizaru deserves a raise after this. Man stuck between a battle between gods and demons. His next performance review better be good. Well, really, I guess that would depend on his performance, which right now this is not so good. But apart from the literal size differential, that's probably why Kizaru feels so small in this conflict. You've got god and demon, and then stuck in the middle of that is a teeny tiny mere mortal. Someone feared amongst humans, and in fact someone who represents the pinnacle of human power, but when you compare that to the gods of the world, he seems so out of place and practically useless in both assisting the demon or fighting against the god. It hasn't been like this the whole time. Luffy and Kizaru did have a very solid fight earlier, but this particular moment reminds me of the chasm between Luffy and Kuzan on Long Ring Longland. The first admiral the crew met, mate, that felt like running into a god. And now we're at the stage where we're playing with admirals like action figures, like just how far we've come. I keep imagining how Doflamingo is reacting to all of this while in prison. The day this newspaper gets thrown at that man's face will probably be the greatest day of his life. Since being imprisoned in Impel Down, Doflamingo has actually gone on quite the journey of character growth, because he now realizes that he was never the one playing the game. He was a mere piece within a greater game being played by others. And with that knowledge, he's now cackling to himself endlessly into madness, hearing about everyone else still struggling within that game that he was lucky enough to get out of. So if I had to choose which one he would choose, I think Doflamingo would be supporting Luffy here. Not because he believes in Luffy or wants to see him succeed, but because Luffy, he's the most entertaining. Very much operating on the Big News Morgan's principle of reporting world events. Although I have to imagine that Doflamingo would take some pretty great satisfaction in the idea of an Elder Star being defeated. After all, they were the ones who denied his birthright and refused to allow him back into the Holy Land after that unfortunate incident with Don Quixote Bad Dad. In the panel with Vegapunk's recorded message, there's also what looks like a heartbeat monitor that has flatlined. So this is a fantastic detail that I didn't notice on my first read-through, but on the last page you can see a monitor in the bottom right-hand corner of this panel which appears to be showing your classic flatline. It would be a pretty big stretch to suggest that this is anything but a heart monitor. And if so, Oda would be deliberately misleading us by using this established global language. So I don't know what else to say. I think that we may have just lost Dr. Vegapunk. We do have some hope though, because there's an idea floating around that Vegapunk may not be dead, and that's because his brain was removed to construct Punk Records. So the idea is that Vegapunk's body dies, but his consciousness is still living on, which I imagine it has to in some way, otherwise everything gathered in Punk Records just falls apart. It would be almost like the opposite of what happened to Kuma. His mind was stripped away from his body, whereas Vegapunk's body is stripped away from his mind. Well, after he literally stripped his mind away from his body, that is. He did 2 strippings. And in the case of a double stripping, maybe this isn't a recording. Perhaps this is Vegapunk's remaining brain taking over with some sort of generated avatar, essentially turning Vegapunk into the first in-world One Piece VTuber. I also feel bad saying this because it's not bringing anything new to the table, but it just does not stop it from being true. Saturn killing Vegapunk has once again ended up shooting the world government straight in the crotch. If I was to boil this entire arc down to one single metaphor, it would be Saint Saturn picking up a 6-shot revolver and proceeding to shoot himself 6 times. At almost every step of the way, if Saturn had been even mildly less ruthless, then the world government would be sitting pretty right now. But because he had to inflict the maximum amount of heartless dickery, everything is coming back to bite them. Vegapunk telling Luffy to take care of Boonie basically means that she will join the crew. In this chapter, Vegapunk does give the distinct impression that Bonnie would be subject to what we call the Nico Robin treatment, meaning being hunted down her entire life, because she and only she has the supreme ability to do a thing, in this case authority over the greatest weapons developed since the ancient weapons. And we all know that Robin's solution to that was to find a crew who would protect her, and somewhere that she could call home. So it's very hard to see the Straw Hats taking Bonnie off the island just to dump her somewhere else, not after being told by Vegapunk to protect her, and especially not after failing to keep their promise promised to him, which was to get him off the island. This is the sort of thing I think Nami would take quite seriously. She has a very strong affinity for the best interests of children, and after being torn apart from her own mother Belmere, she may be more inclined to play that role for Bonnie. I can't imagine that Bonnie would actually want to be anywhere else either, because she finally found Nika. Whatever remains of her father's legacy is currently living through Luffy and the incoming dawn of the world. And it's not as if Bonnie is useless either. She's an incredibly powerful pirate in her own right and has practically infinite potential. You can almost see Luffy training her in a very unconventional way, by which I mean he does weird stuff and she copies it. At the same time though, I can't allow myself to get too carried away, because all logical signs pointed to Yamato joining the crew as well. So you can't trust what characters say they want to do and what seems like the obvious course of action. Although I do think you could argue this either way. Protecting Bonnie may actually mean something like leaving her on Elbaf, because the journey to Laugh-Tale would be far too dangerous, and it would be highly irresponsible to bring a 12-year-old child into a massive world war. But then again, bringing a 12-year-old child with an army of pacifista into a war, that would be slightly less irresponsible, and potentially even strategically the right thing to do. That might be what it comes down to though. Sure, there's plenty of room for Bonnie aboard the Thousand Sunny, but can the Straw Hats really house 50 Buccaneer-sized robots? 51 including the original Kuma, 52 including the Kuma Cop, and who knows how many other Kumai are out there? Because it would be hard to imagine Bonnie just leaving all of her assorted dads behind. Unless she gave them a very broad command like go forth and do some good things for the world. Because it's been an awfully long time since this planet has had a true taste of the saint that is Kuma. I met a girl clubbing last weekend named Bonnie. She wanted to take me home, but I just couldn't bring myself to do anything to her other than parenting. Yeah, I think that One Piece may have ruined the name Bonnie. I don't think I will ever meet a new person named Bonnie again and not automatically have my mind go, yeah, but what if you're secretly 12? I actually think Kizaru cauterized Vegapunk's wound, which is why he's able to move now. So that idea, it did occur to me, I just wasn't sure how much of it was pure cope. Kizaru just so happens to stab Vegapunk through the hole that was made by Saturn, curious, potentially cauterizing the wound and stopping Vegapunk from bleeding out. And weirdly enough, something similar has happened, but it didn't result in that outcome. When Sakazuki donutted Ace, the Heat could have, well in the fictional pirate realm if theoretically, cauterized Ace's wound and allow him to not die maybe. I think the discussion is all a bit pointless though, because the tricky thing is that when you go back and actually look at it, Vegapunk wasn't stabbed in the same place. Saturn hit Vegapunk in very much the upper chest area, whereas Kizaru shot much lower. So I don't think it's the same wound, and Vegapunk is now far more on the Swiss cheese side of the human to Swiss cheese spectrum. The Blackbeards, plural, allowed Aokiji to join their crew, and he's an ex-Marine, so I reckon Carabo has a chance. I think he has much more than just a chance. With his knowledge of the ancient weapon locations, he could be even more useful than a Marine Admiral. But the situations are very different. If we were to put this into dating terms, then Kuzan was the one playing it cool during their courtship. Blackbeard was all over him, begging Kuzan to go out with him, until Kuzan finally caved. But with Carabo, the situation has flipped, and our dearest Swamp Nakama is the one coming off as desperate. It's a stupid analogy, but I do think that heavily contributes to Kuzan's position here. If he was the one who approached them, then the crew would be even more suspicious of him than they already are. And if this was Kuzan's plan all along to infiltrate Blackbeard's crew, then he masterfully dangled himself out in the open as bait for Blackbeard to take, thus making Blackbeard think that it was his idea to get Kuzan into the crew. Bluegrass's power is perfect for controlling the giant robot. You know, you're not wrong. Bluegrass does have a weirdly specific Devil Fruit ability, and it may very well be a plot device designed to counter the Iron Giant if and when that bad boy ever decides to rock up. We are still waiting for you, sir. But Bluegrass is significantly more dangerous than that, because when Bluegrass explains her ability, she states, and I quote, "I can take a ride on anything or anyone." And the raw sexual tension within that statement, it is palpable in the comment section with responses like, "Bluegrass can control me any day." But this means that she can theoretically hop onto Luffy and take full control of him, or Saint Saturn, or Kizaru, or anyone. This may actually be the ultimate one-hit KO Devil Fruit. And so it's worrying, very worrying, that she's on her way into the island right now with Dole, because Bluegrass can do some serious damage. Clearly, the little garden girl is actually Kureha. She stays on drum hoping to to hear about her old friends from Little Garden. So this is referencing something I mentioned in the previous video. I brought up Yuki, the little girl who accidentally started Dory and Broggy's duel, and posed the question of whether or not she's still alive. If she was still alive, she'd probably be around 110, something like that. And whilst Yuki does mean snow, and Kureha spends a lot of time around snow, so many Yukis, look at all these Yukis, I don't think that it can be her because Kureha is much older at a healthy 141 years of age. So this is crazy, but Dr. Kureha was 39 when Dory and Broggy began their duel. That's insane. Kureha was almost middle-aged before the century-long conflict began, or at least what we consider to be middle-aged. And to bring things back to Bluegrass, it's also been proposed that she could be Yuki on her way to a reunion with Dory and Broggy. I suppose she does have a similar hairstyle, and she does look sufficiently withered. I'd believe she was over 100. I'd never say it to her face, but I'd believe it. And maybe that's why she was so curious to talk to Dole about the Giants. But also, this is a colossal stretch. Crazy twist if so, but probably not. So we're gonna talk about that cover page spread, especially given the Reiju and Toshigi moments there. I guess we are going to talk about it. This week's color spread isn't a random assortment of characters. It was made to promote the new One Piece Heroines novel featuring Boa Hancock, Toshigi, Uta, and Reiju. The Heroines universe is published quite similarly to the actual One Piece manga. They're short stories that get included with each new edition of One Piece magazine. And eventually, when there's enough stories, they get bundled up into an actual novel that gets sold. And some of them are quite interesting. In the first volume, there was a story about how Robin spent her time with the Revolutionary Army during the time skip, where she deciphers an ancient tablet that turns out to be a recipe for ancient soup. There was also a great one about Perona desperately wanting to make sangria and concocting a plan to steal Mihawk's wine, which was actually based on one of Oda's cover art requests from 2018, where Perona is doing exactly that, making sangria with the stolen wine with the help of a legion of black cats. They're all pretty fun, low-stakes stories, not at all essential to read, and in fact, I think they take place in their own universe, a universe that's one step closer to our reality. But anyway, on the color spread, it's difficult to ignore Reiju giving Toshigi the look of an impending slurp. So either Toshigi has just ingested some deadly poison, or Reiju is being very forward about some other desires here. I suppose that is typical Vinsmoke behavior. Reiju is doing everything Sanji wishes he could get away with. Will Robin wake up to hear the biggest historical news of their era, or will she keep sleeping? Me worries. So Robin is currently knocked out quite soundly, and it would be pretty sad if everyone else heard the truth of the world except for her. You know, that thing that she's dedicated her entire life to uncovering. But whatever Vegapunk is about to drop on the world isn't going to be the full story. Yes, he's conducted some very naughty taboo research about a very bad century, but the conclusion of this was always meant to be written by Robin. And if you'd like to stay up to date with the conclusion of Egghead Island, then don't forget to subscribe to this channel for consistent injections of One Piece culture administered directly into your YouTube feed.